Great. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of our global audience today, and welcome to the launch event of the UCL Warning Research Centre, the first such centre within the Department of Science and Technology Studies here at UCL, and the world's only centre dedicated to researching warnings. I am Dr. Carina Fearnley, Director of the UCL Warning Research Centre, and I am the Associate Professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies and will be your host today. I am part of a broader team bringing you today's event, and we hope that you will find the day interesting, and we have a superb lineup today. Let me just bring those slides back up. So today we have a fantastic lineup, and we're going to have some brilliant conversations today, all exploring what warnings mean, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We are virtual today for the launch, and whilst it is very sad that we can't meet in person and have those wonderful informal chats during our tea breaks and also following the event, it does mean we can, however, welcome guests from all around the world, both as participants and observers. So welcome, and we're really glad to have you here. And this makes it a truly international event where we can get insights, guests and attendees from all over the world that wouldn't normally be able to attend. So there's always a silver lining to the situation, and we've tried to take advantage of this whilst COVID-19 restrictions sadly remain. So before I get started, just a few housekeeping issues. So please do use the chat function on the side to introduce yourself, share links, share resources, or to make comments about what's going on. If you do have any questions for the panel members, please pop those in the Q&A. If you pop them in the chat, they'll probably get lost. So please put questions in the Q&A, and then the session lead will be able to pick those up and be able to ask those to the speakers. Panelists, please make sure that your videos are off and your microphones are muted whilst you're not speaking. And of course, any security breaches or issues we will deal with, or please do flag them to our attention. If you're sharing your thoughts on social media, the hashtag today is UCLWRC. And please feel to log in and out during the tea breaks or stretch your legs. The event will be live all afternoon. And then my final housekeeping issue is that the event will be recorded so that those can watch the event once, if they can't make it or wish to look over something again. So what I want to do today is to start off with just a brief overview of what warnings mean. And actually, we're building on two events that are launching the centre. Last week's event was looking at why warnings matter, where we hosted the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction's 11th annual conference. And at that conference, we looked at the rationale for warnings, health warnings, warnings for expected versus unexpected events, and also for business continuity. And we drew on a huge range of different stakeholders and actors within the disaster world. And the centre was formally launched by Mami Mizuturi, the head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was a great event. But what we're going to do this week is to shift to actually ask what warnings mean. And this is a really important question because we keep failing to listen to warnings, to acknowledge them, to act on them, and to make those difference. And what we need to do is understand why that is. And that means asking what warnings mean. And by doing that, hopefully we can get a better grip about what warnings are. Now, warnings are typically seen as a technological tool. We would have a siren that would go off and we would respond to that. Is sort of the first image that people think about warnings. And indeed, sometimes we see these warning signs, whether they're of biohazards or other traffic warning signs, but these clearly require that we understand and know what those warning signs mean. Sometimes warnings are given through official sources, as you can see through the NOAA poster in the bottom right here, where you can see, official sources are given by wireless emergency alerts and text messages, outdoor sirens, the radio, telephone, and so on. And of course, we have warning signs that we can pick up individually, nature's warning signs about, for example, tsunami. We could hear a loud roar from the ocean, sea levels rising or falling, or strong earthquake. And we have warnings also in our history, in our religion, in our oral oral traditions about events that have happened, that have caused suffering, and warnings that we should heed in terms of changes in our environment. So what is the point of a warning? Well, a warning is really a way of trying to create an instant level of importance or awareness about some information that people need to know. It's really a trigger point to start the communication or to make a decision about an action that needs to be done. And these are typically given through these iconographies that you can see here on the right. They are also typically part of a broader framework, which is designed to help actually create the structure so that people can know what a warning sign is, know what it means, and be able to respond to it effectively. And that requires a huge amount of effort across all disaster risk reduction efforts and disaster management tools in terms of coordination plans, responses, education and outreach, and so on. But how do we communicate meaning? So this is actually Stuart Hall's model of encoding and decoding, created in 1973, but still incredibly valid today. And really there's a lot of challenges involved in when we issue a warning as to what the interpretation of that warning will be by the person who receives it. And there's all sorts of cultural framings and understandings that shape both how the message is formed, how it's communicated, and how it is understood. And Stuart Hall famously said that meaning is not simply fixed or determined by the speaker or the sender. In fact, the message is never transparent, and the audience is not a passive recipient of meaning. This kind of opens up the whole Pandora box when we think about warnings and how challenging and complicated they really can be. And then we think about how context is really important. And I go back to a quote from my PhD research, which is now well over 11 years old, but it's a really good quote to exemplify how context is everything. So if we're giving a warning, this scientist was saying, when I try and describe this problem to people, I often use a medical analogy. You know, there's a tremendous amount of information about the population of people and about the percentage of people who will have heart attacks. But when you come down to one person, you can't say, well, you are going to have a heart attack at the age of 63. We can say that 35% of the population will have a heart attack by 63, but we can't say anything about an individual. And so this is why context is so important, knowing that individual person or that individual setting to be able to give an effective warning. And this presents challenges because we're increasingly looking at having to give warnings, not just on local scales, on national scales and international and global scales, especially for large scale events. And whilst local warnings are able to be flexible and designed for that local needs and usually have a huge buy-in by the community that's shaped around their own needs and their own understandings and gives them ownership. A national level or even a globalized level system can help provide some common terminology and understanding and streamlines communication between different government agencies or international organizations that can help reduce confusion and enhance cooperation. And this is certainly the kind of thing that we would like to have seen a bit more of with COVID-19. So how can we generate meaning? Well, the amazing scholar Dennis Maletti, who famously published Disasters by Design, said what is said and not said in a public warning message has a profound effect on what people think and then do in response to hearing that warning message. Dennis was very passionate about warnings, and it is very tragic that COVID-19 unfortunately led to our loss of Dennis Maletti last year. He was an early affiliate and supporter of the Warning Research Centre, and we aim to honour his work as part of the centre. It is a heartbreaking loss, but we hope to build on the extraordinary work that he did around warnings. So warnings, in order to help create that meaning, have to be part of a system. And so when we look at how we define a warning system, it's defined by the UNDRR as an integrated system of hazard monitoring, forecasting and prediction, disaster risk assessment, communication and preparedness, activities, systems and processes, there's a lot of different systems and things going on, that enable individuals, communities, governments, businesses and others, so lots of different stakeholders, to take timely action to reduce disaster risks in advance of a hazardous event. Now, this system is essentially a complex system. It's a system that's adaptive, a complex adaptive system that works in a dynamic network of interactions that are constantly changing. It's adapting in the sense that the individual and the collective behaviour are changing, and they're all self-organising. So it's not just the natural phenomenon, it's about how people are responding and the environment. And this is constantly changing, and we need to adapt and be able to cope with the complexities that that presents. In order to do this, in order to create these meanings and have value in those meanings, in order to be able to cope with the complexities involved, to accommodate differing scales, we need to understand that early warnings are part of a social process. And these two quotes by Ilan, Kelman and Mickey Glantz highlight that we need to work beyond just being technical systems that hand out information to a community, to actually working to being end-to-end early warning systems that indicate feedback loops and various pathways from which information comes and to which information flows. So today we're opening up that Pandora's box. We're going to look at some history and try and understand how different civilizations and groups of people have come to embed warnings in their culture. For example, the Maori talk about the concept of tapu, where it refers to sacred and forbidden places such as the summits of volcanoes that have prevented the Maori from building and living and endangering their livelihoods around many volcanoes in New Zealand for many, many, many years. We'll also be looking at arts and the way that art can help express warnings or convey complex ideas. And indeed, this is the screen by Edvard Munch, which famously symbolises the anxiety of the human condition and commonly associated with issues around climate change. And then finally, we'll be looking at policy and the role of policy on a national, international level, and the role that these big organisations have in shaping the way that warning generates meaning for many different stakeholders. So finally, I just end up with a little bit about the UCL Warning Research Centre. This centre is established because there is no focused warning research centre in the world globally that looks specifically at warnings. And the aim of this centre is to bring together a huge range of stakeholders across many different disciplines, geographies, and livelihood contexts. And we want to quite uniquely cut across different vulnerabilities, hazards, and threats to bring different warning systems and alerts and alarms together in a way that's not been done before, to build on existing literature and explore the cutting edge of warnings and help, hopefully, to reframe what warnings might mean and help make them more effective for populations. We aim to address a number of key questions. We aim to pursue the agenda of warning and make that sure that it's firm up there in many organisations' priorities, to enhance disaster risk reduction and preparedness by developing fully integrated warning systems, to learn about these different natural hazards and man-made threats and how warnings can be, we can learn lessons from those and apply them in different areas, to challenge and investigate how we can make warnings work on local and standard, in local yet standardised formats, and analyse which makes good practices for warnings. We want to look at the communication tools that warnings look at and how we can use those to engage the many different stakeholders involved and help create legitimacy, relevance and credibility within a policy environment. So we're globally unique, as I said before. We currently consist of around 25 core members across UCL and 20 affiliates, leading warning scholars and practitioners from all over the globe. And we aim to establish a global centre of excellence around warnings that provides that communities for people studying and working within warnings to share ideas, to have conversations, to help build research expertise, teaching excellence, generate policy advice and good public engagement. And we already have one working group based on the volcano alert level working group. During 2021, we've had a busy start to the year. We've already given evidence to the House of Lords under the Inquiry of Risk Assessment and Risk Planning Committee. We've provided a training course for Doctors with Africa, QUAM, who are an NGO providing healthcare across the African continent. We've been involved in a number of different events across UCL. And we've also been involved in a number of new centres that are being established, for example, looking at space health and risk. So we'll be looking at space warnings going forward. And we have 3 internships in place, and we've got Simone Philips and Calum Mackay today as a part of their time with us, showing some of the work that they've done and sharing some of the sessions. So we've got a busy year ahead. We're going to be having some webinars with some world-leading warning experts, getting into some of the details of the topics that we've talked about over the last week or so. We're going to be building our resources on the website, continuing our policy work, continuing our training courses, and building teaching capacity across UCL, and hopefully providing a space for warning research and publications. Please take a look at our website and have a look at our various links and social media and follow us. So we welcome your input today to come to us with your ideas, for you to collaborate and input. This centre is to create a space for all of us in order to benefit and share in our discussions around warnings. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to the team that have helped set up the event today, and also the Warning Research Centre, in particular my deputy Ilan, Kelman, and my departmental support through Giuseppe, Victoria, and our heads of department. Talking of which, before we go into our first session, I would just like to hand over now to one of our head of departments, Professor Emma Tobin, who's just going to say a couple of words about the Warning Centre.
Thank you, Carina. So welcome everybody. It's very, very exciting to be here today. I'll try not to keep you long because I know we've got some really, really excellent talks ahead of us this afternoon. But by way of introduction, I'm Professor Emma Tobin, and I'm the co-head of Department of Science and Technology Studies with my colleague, Professor John Agar. And just a little bit of context about STS. So STS is an interdisciplinary department. It's housed in maths and physical sciences here at UCL, but we're a very mixed bunch of people. So we have historians, philosophers, social scientists, public communication and engagement experts. And I guess on behalf of the STS department, I just want to say I'm delighted to welcome you all to this launch event today. I think it really is a momentous and very, very exciting occasion, because in part it shows what STS does best. We work collaboratively, we bring together diverse, global and interdisciplinary expertise to deal with real world problems. And I think what Carina's done very well there in her introduction is shown just how complex some of those problems can be. And we think that interdisciplinary lens can really add something new and something special. This centre also brings us a really great opportunity to consolidate Dr. Carina Fearnley's very important research and exciting research, and I hope it will bring it to the international stage as it deserves to be. And the launch of this centre is also, I think, very timely in this pandemic year, where warnings themselves have taken, of course, a space on the international stage. So we're very excited to host the UCL Warning Centre at STS, and we're looking forward to promoting its research activities over the coming years. Thanks very much to all the speakers who've signed up to talk to us today. Carina, back to you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your very kind words. We're very excited. And so we shall move swiftly on to our first of 3 sessions today, as I said, looking at historical depictions of warnings, with our panel sessioned by our amazing intern, Simone Philips. So I'll pass over to you, Simone. And again, please do use the chat to introduce yourself and carry on the conversations.
All right, hi everyone, and thank you, Carina, for the introduction. I'm very excited to be part of the launch of this Warning Research Centre. A bit about me, I'm Simone, a master's student at the University of Glasgow in a geography program called Earth Futures, in which we take an interdisciplinary look at a number of big challenges now facing the global community. Prior to that, my work was in marine meteorology. For my internship at WRC, I have spent the past few months putting together a database of historical research and depictions of warnings. One thing that I've found to be the most surprising was how little consensus there actually is on the definition of warning. We're bombarded by the word nowadays, referring to things like trigger warnings, hurricane warnings, even disciplinary warnings. So what I've been trying to do is answer that question for myself. What is a warning? After sifting through as many examples of historical research and literature around warnings as I could get to, and in the context of more recent work, I've started to notice that at the center of all warnings are stories, be them myths loosely based on an event that happened a long time ago, or a personal experience of a disaster shared with a neighbor, or nowadays with a social media group even. As a species, we've been sharing examples and experiences and ideas with each other for millennia. And as can be seen in the preserved art around, say, a group hunting expedition found in a cave, communication of hazards and of useful skills like how to hunt without getting killed or how to prepare for cyclic changes in river levels has been important to our survival, which has itself always been a collective effort. But we can't really communicate hazards without someone having first experienced them and identified the impact within the context of our own culture. Sorry, apologies, I just got something popped up. Yes, and without that context, a warning signal can become essentially useless or have a very different meaning than the intended one. So I would argue that a warning is complex and something fully integrated into and cannot be separated from a society. It is community knowledge that provides us with an understanding of what has happened in the past, thus how that could impact us today. What people did about these events in the past that was either beneficial or destructive to their society, and thus how we should react to such events in the future. And this really puts warnings at the center of our everyday lives. I'd also say much of what would be called warnings today could be more accurately called warning signals or alerts. Signals being things that occur as a sign that a historically destructive event is or will be taking place. Once we notice these signals, they can then be communicated to others within our society who may be impacted as alerts or alarms. As an example, some historic communities indigenous to hurricane-prone areas like the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico believe different deities were the cause of different aspects of hurricanes, like winds and flooding, a belief that was shared through story and song. Many locals in these regions also recognized the cyclic nature of the tropical systems and did things to reduce risk, like living in elevated areas, relying on root vegetables, planting rows of trees around villages to protect from the wind, and even migrating. Many familiar with the storms could also recognize cloud formations that identified their incoming. In this case, things like the start of the summer served as a signal of higher risk of cyclones, and the clouds signaled that a storm may soon hit. Beyond this, the translation of these stories and their underlying warnings into daily actions taken led to reduction in the risk of disaster. Historically, these signs have also been shown in things like the retreat of water before a tsunami or even spotting approaching enemy troops. And beyond just word of mouth, alerts have come in the form of bells and various types of semaphores or visual ways of communicating an incoming threat, say with smoke, flag, or light signals. And I mean, I've barely begun to scratch the surface of what's out there, and I could really spend forever formulating my ideas about warnings, but this has really been a quick view of where my work so far has taken me. I'm excited to see where the Warning Center takes us in the years to come as this community continues to interact and grow, incorporating ideas from more backgrounds and geographies. So in this session, I have 3 amazing panelists here, and we're going to discuss history and historical depictions of warnings from a global perspective. We'll start with each panelist having about 10 minutes to tell us a bit more about themselves and their work around this topic. We'll then watch a short 3.5-minute video created by UN Women Bangladesh, followed by a brief conversation about the video by panel members before jumping into a Q&A. If you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A section and I'll get to what I can at the end. So I'd like to welcome each of our panelists. First, we have Dr. Alice Bennett. She's a senior lecturer in English literature at Liverpool Hope University. She's currently writing a book called Alarm, which explores the history and culture of alarms for Bloomsburg Object Lesson Series. So welcome, Alice. If you want to go ahead and give a quick introduction about you and what you've been doing, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Simone, for the lovely introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to hear the papers later on this afternoon. So I'm going to just quickly share some slides on the screen with you. So I'm going to talk a bit about my current project and a bit also about how I ended up working on this. So I've previously worked on fiction and questions of attention. So I came to the idea of alarms and alerts through thinking about them as objects which administer, control, or organize attention for individuals or for groups. And so my current project is a book which looks at the cultural representations of alarm technology, so different kinds of alarms like sirens, alarm clocks, the development of the smoke alarm, and so on, but also is interested in the kinds of cultural practices that circulate around alarms, alerts, and warnings. So what I thought I would do today was choose one particular example or case study from the book. So I'm going to choose one textual example because I'm a literature scholar, and I'm going to think about it from some perspectives which should chime with other things we'll talk about in the panel to do with meaning making, gender, and the social processes of warning. So the example that I want to talk about comes from a Greek tragedy. So I'm going to talk about Aeschylus's play Agamemnon, which is the first play in his cycle, the Oresteia. And so Agamemnon is a play in which Aeschylus reworks the story of Cassandra, who famously was cursed by the god Apollo to be able to predict the future, but never to be believed. So she was given the gift of prophecy, but also the curse of never having her warnings taken on board. And so I'm interested in this play because the way that Aeschylus develops this myth into the version of the story that he tells is through thinking about contemporary technology for warnings and about the social practices of warnings from the time when he was writing. So the tragedy is written in the 5th century BCE, and I'm going to talk a bit about the early part of this first play, when we see Agamemnon, the king of Argos, returning from the Trojan War, bringing with him Cassandra. But before he arrives, we get a description of the warning processes which are in place at Argos in order for his wife, Clytemnestra, to realize that he's returning and to eventually murder him. And the reason that she plans to murder him is significant because one of the reasons that feeds into her decision is that he had ritually sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia before he went to Troy. So he had been told in a prophecy that he would need her to die in order to get fair winds to go to Troy. So I'm essentially arguing that we can read Aeschylus's play as a play which is interested in two kinds of warnings. In prophecy as a warning, and it's really suspicious of prophecy and supernatural warnings, but it's also very interested in depicting the technology and the historical material technology of warning systems. So the reason that I make this argument is that the play starts with a character who's a watchman sitting on the roof of the palace in Argos, seeing the signal beacons from Troy and hearing news that Troy has fallen and therefore that the king and the young men of the city will be returning home. And as we get into the play, it becomes clear that this system of signal beacons between Troy and Mycenae, or Argos, the main city, has been established by Clytemnestra, the queen. And so I'm going to show you on the screen the long speech which Clytemnestra gives in the play to explain how she set up this system of warnings. So the reason that she has to make this speech is because the chorus in the play, which is made up by the elderly men of Argos, don't believe her when she says that she knows that Agamemnon is coming home. So they think that it's come to her in a dream, or that she's been informed by a fortune teller. And so she has to explain the process that she's put in place as a warning system, and therefore to justify the knowledge that she has of his return. So this incredible long 30-line speech early on in the play, I've had to remove a bit from the middle because it's so long, shows Clytemnestra describing the places along the route that the signal fire travels between Troy and Argos. So she lists the locations of the beacons. She describes the kind of attention and vigilance that each of the sentinels at these beacons will have been required to keep up during the period when they've been waiting for news from Troy. And so she's essentially celebrating her authority and her planning here, explaining exactly how she knows this. So this ought to be a kind of triumphant moment for Clytemnestra. But at the end of the speech, she has to explain that in some ways her power is passed like a torch to her from her husband. So even as she's celebrating her light-bringing strategy, she explains that she's offering this evidence to the elder statesmen of Troy, the old men of Troy, sent to her from her husband. So she's acknowledging that her power is somehow passed to her from her husband, and it definitely has limits. So signal beacons like this one would have been more commonly used as an early warning system in case of attack. So it's a literal call to arms here. But on the face of it, what's happened is that Clytemnestra has repurposed this alarm system in order to warn instead of peace and of victory. But the audience would have known the rest of the plot of the play. So an audience coming to watch a Greek tragedy would have known what unfolded in the rest of the play, that she was in fact planning to murder her husband, and that this was a real call to arms for Clytemnestra when she sees the information from the signal beacon. When she gets the warning, she's ready to arm herself. So Aeschylus's version of this old story of Cassandra's prophecies and of the murder of Agamemnon by his wife reworks this story of warnings into something which brings together two kinds of warnings, the supernatural and the technological. And the technology of Clytemnestra's warning system is established very clearly in parallel to and as a rejection of supernatural prophecies and portents. And so we're invited to compare them because of the structure of the play. Both warnings, though, invite people to be prepared, to ready themselves for a coming event. And so I'm interested in the ways in which we can maybe think about the comparisons between warnings and safety cultures and drama itself. So in this sense, we might say that safety procedures have quite a lot in common with theatre. It involves rehearsal, repetition, scripting, drills, simulation. Theatre likes to be prepared. It invokes a temporal structure which involves rehearsal and repetition and preparation. So essentially the case that I've been making here is that I think through looking at historical and cultural objects, we can understand something about the history of the cultures and societies which surround processes of warning, as well as the technology itself of warning and of alarm. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Alice. That's really interesting. I love the perspective you gave from the cultural aspect of warnings and alarms and like around Greek tragedies. It's not even something I had really come across as much as like yet, but yeah. All right, so next we have Mr. Mohsin. He's the Secretary for the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief for the government of Bangladesh. As a member of Bangladesh Civil Service, he has more than 30 years of experience in different ministries. He is leading the national policy formulation and implementation in disaster risk management and played a key role in preparing the National Plan for Disaster Management for 2016 to 2020 and 2021 to 25, as well as standing orders on disaster 2019. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mohsin.
Thank you, Simone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Distinguished panelists, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bangladesh. My sincere gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to share early warning system of Bangladesh in this important event. 2021 is a very significant year for our country. We are celebrating birth centenary of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and 50 years of our independence. First, I would like to start with the remarkable quotation of Bangabandhu. In 1972, he said, quote, "We have to construct adequate shelters and develop proper early warning system to combat cyclone," unquote. In the same year, he established Cyclone Preparedness Program, CPP, a volunteer-based organization acknowledged as a global best practice in the right side practice. In the right side is our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the worthy daughter of Bangabandhu. With the spirit of Bangabandhu, she makes Bangladesh as a role model in disaster management. You see in this slide, Bangladesh is now recognized as the role model in case of the disaster management. Indian Prime Minister, His Excellency Narendra Modi, identified Bangladesh's community-based early warning system as a global best practice. He mentioned this word in 2016. And former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Bangladesh has the best teacher in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Bangladesh is the largest delta, having vast floodplains with over 700 rivers. We have more than 160 million people and more than 1,100 people live per square kilometer. Despite the population density, poverty rate is decreasing steadily. Due to the climate-induced and the seismic hazards, our country is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. As shown in the slide, historically, we have faced many disasters. I don't want to go through, but you can see flood, storm, epidemic, earthquake, drought, landslide, etc. And then, according to German Watch Global Climate Risk Index 2021, Bangladesh is ranked as the 7th most affected country by extreme weather events between 2000 to 2019. During the COVID-19 pandemic situation, we faced floods 5 times in a year in a row in 2020, and over 5.4 million people affected by the floods. And it was the 4th worst disaster in the world. We formulated several policy frameworks, such as Disaster Management Act. It's approved by the Parliament 2012, and then Disaster Management Policy 2015, National Plan for Disaster Management for 2021 to 2025, and then standing orders on disaster, etc. We are also updating these policies on a regular basis according to the need. In this slide, it's very much interesting, you see. It shows the evolution of disaster management approach in Bangladesh. We have divided five approaches. After many trial and errors, we have shifted from a relief-based reactive to a risk reduction-based proactive approach, integrating whole of society approach. You have seen the first generation, only the life saved. Second generation, flood and cyclone preparedness. Third generation, institutional preparedness. And then fourth generation, community preparedness. And then fifth generation, whole of society approach. Analyzing various weather-related information, Bangladesh meteorological see 11. Okay, and you see in this slide, Bangladesh has been developing legal and institutional mechanism with the changing needs following the Yokohama strategy. Here goes framework, and then the Sendai framework. You see, in line with the international framework, Bangladesh also prepared the standing orders on disasters, then the policy, and the SUD again. So we are absolutely on board, and according to the international framework, we are working on that. And then an end-to-end cyclone early warning system of Bangladesh has been developed under the strong policy and institutional framework. As you see, we have established 5 Doppler weather radar covering entire country. Among them, 2 radars are being replaced with the latest one. Analyzing various weather-related information, our country meteorological department issues the warning message. They have developed adequate capacity and the focused and early warning products, and are very reliable for early action as well. You can see here from the BMD, Bangladesh Weather Department, to finally to the end user. Then the early warning messages are sent to the community through different channels such as television, national and community radios, very high frequency radios, and mobile phone is very popular nowadays. For the evacuation, we have more than 5,000 dedicated and inclusive multi-purpose cyclone shelters. Educational and commercial buildings are also used as shelters during disasters. We have the laws that anytime the local administration can declare even the private houses as a shelters. This is a system in our country. And then in this slide, you see the early warning messages are sent to the community through, and then for better community understanding, for the warning message, Bangladesh is using the color-coded flag system for the cyclone. You see, for the signal 4, lifting 1 flag. For the signal 5, 6, 7, lifting 2 flags, and then the signal 8, 9, 10, lifting 3 flags. And then the volunteers, as the first line defense, play a vital role to disseminate the early warning messages to the last mile. We have around 5 million volunteers in our different organizations. And for the cyclone, we have over 76,000 volunteers working under CPP. And I'm very happy to inform you that out of them, 50% are women. And so that the early warning system is women friendly, and as well as it empowers them. And then let me share a practical experience. On 20th May 2020, a super cyclone called Amphan hit Bangladesh and West Bengal of India. It caused damage to more than 150 kilometer coastal embankment and 440 kilometer road in our country. After getting the early warning message, CPP, the volunteers and other volunteers informed local people about the cyclone using megaphone and the flags to the necessary preparation. And the volunteers helped community to evacuate to the shelters. Considering the sensitivity of the pandemic situation, our government prepared more number of evacuation shelters so that social distancing could be maintained. As a result, 2.4 million people could evacuate before the cyclone. This slide shows the impressive results of cyclone early warning system of our country. You can see the mortality curve. It has fallen down from 7 digit to the single digit. It is worth to mentioning disaster affects differently to women, children, persons with disabilities and senior citizens due to their vulnerability. We are already making progress in reducing their vulnerability. In 1970 cyclone, 90% of the deceased were women and the children. The ratio between women and children and men was 14:1, and nowadays it is only 1:2. And then the key facts behind success of Bangladesh are the reduction of loss and lives from disasters. You can see how end-to-end early warning system backed by enabling policies and other elements can bring positive changes. As an end note, I would like to mention that Bangladesh has been working to develop such early warning systems for flood, riverbank erosion, landslide, etc. And then before concluding my presentation, I would like to congratulate all the persons related to the launching of Early Warning Research Centre. And this is all. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mohsen, for sharing all the important work that you've been doing in Bangladesh. I understand that this work keeps you super busy, so we're really thankful that you were able to take the time to join us and share your valuable perspective around warnings. So for our third panelist, we have Maureen Fordham. She's a professor of gender and disaster resilience. She's been researching hazards and disasters since 1988 and is an expert on gender and intersectionality, community-based disaster risk reduction, and resilience capacities and vulnerability analysis, focusing particularly on the inclusion of a range of social groups, especially women and children. And if you could also introduce the video after your initial introduction, Maureen, that would be great. And thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. So I'm hoping, let me see. I'm hoping that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
And it's all gone blank. Okay, can you see the proper screen of the full-size screen of the presentation? No.
I can see. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to stop that, and always a problem. It won't let me get out of it.
I think that we're just waiting for Maureen to come back. So we can just give her a minute and hopefully she'll show up. Thanks.
If we could maybe start with a question, Simone, if you maybe want to reflect based on your own work on how we move from Greek theatre to Bangladesh reality. Because you've been doing a lot of research, Simone, covering a lot of material. How do we transfer across time and space based on your own experience?
Definitely. I mean, that's certainly a complex question that I feel like we could get into for a while. But really, I guess what I'll say is that our culture, as Alice was saying, is really a part of how we react to anything, say like a warning about a cyclone coming in, and that sort of thing. So, oh, is that, oh, lovely, but so good to have you back, Maureen. You're on mute.
It went a bit crazy when I tried to share my screen, so I'm going to try again.
All right, great.
Maureen, that's fine. Don't go into presentation mode. Just do it this way. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I decided to do. Okay. Very disappointing. Thank you anyway for the opportunity, and sorry for the glitch, and hopefully the video will work at the end. So I wanted to explore warning systems in historical and social context. And the reason for doing that is I started quite a long time ago in doing this kind of work, and so I wanted an opportunity to look back and also to look ahead, of course, and then end with introducing the film. And when I began this work, it was frequently the case that we had to address the issue of what is a warning system. And I have to say, after a while, I got rather fed up with this because every meeting I went to, I had to make the same kind of arguments. So the arguments really were about at what point does a warning system start and at what point does it end? And so for many people that I was engaging with, the warning system was the technical front end, the monitoring, the detection, the warning of official warning disseminators. Those are the expert systems. And the warning of those at risk, that was quite often just left off the agenda because that was seen as somebody else's business. It was carried out not by the professional technicians, but by other actors and often people in the community themselves. And the small picture that you see on the right that I began with, and that's courtesy of Professor Dennis Parker from Middlesex University. And it's an example of a police officer knocking at the door of somebody's home to tell them, to give them a warning of the flood. And of course, the flood is already there. The flood is already in their property. And this was a rather typical occurrence. The technology that was available was not the same as today. You know, there were some mobile phones around, but it wasn't a technique that was used. So we didn't have that available to us. And it was often the case that warnings were delivered by police officers in the local area. they became overwhelmed by that. They dropped out of it, and actually the ending of their knocking on doors to give warnings stimulated some quite more creative and innovative ways of issuing warnings directly to those at risk in the UK. But frankly, you know, this is sort of the early 1990s, and it was a mess. So I'd like to show a slide here of some early research at Flood Hazard Research Centre at Middlesex University, and I was there for 7 years. And they had done so many surveys of people flooded and people in flood risk areas who were not actually flooded about their warning experiences. And in a cumulative cross-study analysis, they discovered that only 13% of people who'd been flooded in these surveys actually received a warning. There were quite a lot of people who weren't flooded who received a warning, but the majority of people just did not actually get the warning before the flood waters were in their home. And those warnings also were usually what we termed unofficial warnings. So they were not the knock on the door or the official warning by a professional or an official. They were from friends and neighbours, or they were from direct observation, seeing the water coming up the street and coming into the home. So there was this huge gap in reaching the point at which a warning system could be said to be successful, because the person who was at risk was being warned and they were capable then of taking some action and reducing their damages. So that last really vital part of the whole equation was the piece that was really significantly failing. And I spent, I remember one particular meeting, I spent 2 days with a group of other warnings experts, and I was the last person to speak. And all the speakers over the 2 days had been describing various technologies and new innovations in technology, in detection, etc. And I came along as the last speaker with the slides you've just seen, saying, that's all very well at that technical front end, but what about actually getting a warning to people at the end who actually need it? And it again stimulated the usual discussion, which said, that's not our job. That's not what we do. You know, we're in charge of the warning system, which for them was just this technical front end. But of course, that's really only just one of the key factors for success. But it has been the one that's actually absorbed huge amounts of the available resources of the funding. It's pretty expensive going for high-tech solutions, and yes, they are necessary, but unless you also deal with the last mile, you deal with the knocking on the door or the contacting of the people at risk, then you really can't say that your warning system has been successful. And I want to suggest in this talk really that it's these broader social aspects that are really, really important, but also it's an opportunity for so many other benefits to come from really thinking broadly, thinking laterally about a warning system and what it actually can do. And it isn't, it shouldn't be somebody else's responsibility. So I'm arguing that we've got to embed the warnings in their social context in order to benefit from these wider social benefits. And the inclusivity and the targeting, and particularly around the methods of delivering warnings, the warning content, the voices, who is delivering the warning, these are all very key to really getting a successful outcome. And we're shortly going to see a video where I think it perfectly conveys these things in 3 minutes, 42 seconds. So warnings are social interactions. Mami Mitsutori said last week, has been referred to previously, but she referred to warnings as gateways to risk reduction and unlocking behavior leading to resilience. That the Bangladesh film we'll see, hopefully, if technology is with us. And I think I might ask Simone to launch that film shortly. That's an example from a Bangladesh context, expanding the roles of women as responders, as community leaders, increasing their resilience in doing so, their ability to engage in this wider protective behavior in the community and gaining respect for their actions. And another example briefly, another favorite of mine from El Salvador and work done by Plan International in the early 2000s. And that, for example, would be the San Isidro Youth Emergency Committee and their risk map. And the significance of this one, where you can see these wider social benefits coming from a warning system, is that youth members in this community are active members of the warning chain. So they're not just seen as vulnerable community members in need of receiving a warning. They are the warning. And this has had enormous personal benefits for them, also for local women leaders who help support developing the warning systems. And you see in the image on the right, their very low-tech version of their risk map, but this fit their available resources, but it fit their conditions and their understandings, and they still gained very significant knowledge of the hazards in their area. So this is the point really that I'd like to return to, that we don't just silo these different bits of warning systems, but we see them in their totality, completely in their social context. And we've already seen Bangladesh as, it's this ongoing example of massive improvements, and the work has also really branched out to develop these broader social benefits. And the kind of respect that the youth in El Salvador, these youth groups, were gaining through being part of this significant community effort is something that warning systems can do if we plan for it. So that is the last point I wanted to make in the presentation, and apologies that you can't see it in full screen. And I wanted to highlight this really interesting video. That the first time I saw it several months ago now, I was just so struck by it, and by the speaker who you'll hear, Mazura Pavin. And she's a unit leader, part of the cyclone preparedness program in a particular district in Bangladesh. It was made by UN Women under the Empower Fund, and there are a whole series of these really very interesting videos. So Simone, in order not to risk further disaster, I will stop sharing that screen, and I'd ask you then to launch that video if you would. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Maureen, for your presentation. Let me get this set up and hopefully it'll go smoothly. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I'll go ahead and play.
Can you put it on full screen? I can't hear it very well. I'm sure others can't.
Apologies. Can you not hear it?
No.
Oh no. Okay. We can. I'll just try to turn the volume up. Yeah.
The audience is saying it is okay because there are subtitles.
Okay, great.
So no problem because of the subtitles, yes.
আমাদের রেড ক্রিসেন্টের মাধ্যমে আমাদের ট্রেনিং করানো হতো। আমি ঘূর্ণিঝড়ে কাজ করছি, তারপর যখন বুলবুলি ঝড় হয়েছে 4 নাম্বার সিগন্যালের পরপরই কিন্তু আশ্রা কেন্দ্রে চলে যায়। চলে যাওয়ার পরে ওখানে যাই দেখি যে আলোর ব্যবস্থা আছে কিনা, পরিষ্কার পরিচ্ছন্ন আছে কিনা। আমি নিজে আশ্রা কেন্দ্রে ঝাড়ু দিচ্ছি। আমরা এই টিম লিডাররা সমস্ত ঝড় কিন্তু অলরেডি চলতেছে, প্রচণ্ড পরিমাণে ঝড় চলতেছে। আমরা এই ঝড়ের মাধ্যমে আমার যে ইউনিয়ন টিম লিডার, আমার টিম লিডার, আমাদের সিপিপির যে স্বেচ্ছাসেবক আছে, পরে ওখান থেকে বেরিয়ে আমরা কিন্তু মাইকিং শুরু করেছি। সমস্ত বাড়ি যেই পুরুষ মানুষ, ওরা তো আর বাড়ির ভিতরে যেতে পারে না। ওরা রাস্তা দিয়ে মাইকিং করে, আমি ওর ভেতর দিয়ে আমি বাড়ির ভেতরে ঢুকে পড়ি, যেই বলি যে তোমরা আশ্রা কেন্দ্রে ওঠো। কারণ গর্ভবতী যারা যে গর্ভবতী থাকে ওদের জন্য তো ঝুঁকি বেশি। গর্ভবতী, প্রতিবন্ধী, শিশু, বৃদ্ধ এদের জন্য তো বেশিরভাগ ঝুঁকি। আমি ওদেরকে আশ্রা কেন্দ্রে নিয়ে যাই। প্রতিবন্ধী আমি নিজে ঘাড়ে করে নিয়ে গেছি। নারীদের জন্য কিন্তু 2টা দুর্যোগ, যেমন আমফান একটা দুর্যোগ, আর তারপরে নারীদের জন্য আরেকটা দুর্যোগ হচ্ছে ওখানে ওই পুরুষ নারী উভয় মিলে ওখানে বিশৃঙ্খলা ঘটে, যে কারণে ওরা সাইক্লোন শেল্টারে যেতে চায় না। কারণ নারীদের যে একটা আলাদা যে একটা পরিবেশ থাকবে, নারীদের যেমন একটা দুগ্ধদানকারী মা, ওই যে পুরুষের সামনে সে তো আর বাচ্চার দুধ দিতে পারে না। আমফান ঝড়ে আমার পুরুষ স্বেচ্ছাসেবক, তুমি নারী, তুমি আমাদের সাথে এসে প্রচারে তুমি থাকবা কেন, তুমি যাও নারীদের ওইখানে যাও, আমাদের সাথে তোমার থাকার দরকার নেই। আমি বলেছি কি যে তুমি পুরুষ, তুমি পারো, আমি নারী, আমি পারি না। আমিও যেমন মানুষ, তারাও তেমন মানুষ, শ্রম তো একই দিচ্ছি। তা আমি বাড়িতে যাব কেন, আর তোমাদের সাথে আমি থাকতে পারবো না কেন? খুব কষ্ট করে আমার এই স্থান অর্জন করতে হয়েছে। মানুষ আমাকে বলে যে তোর ভয় বলতে তোর দিলে নেই। আমার এই স্পৃহার দিকে কিন্তু প্রত্যেকে আমার সহযোগিতা করে। ট্রেনিংয়ের মাধ্যমে আমরা যে কাজ করছি এ দেখে ওদের আগ্রহটা আরও কিন্তু বেশি যাচ্ছে যে ওরাও তো নারী, ওরা যখন করছে আমরাও পারবো না কেন ওদের সাথে সামিল হতে। তাই এই জন্য তো ওরাই এগিয়ে আসছে। পুরুষ যেটা করতে পারে নারীরাও সেটা করতে পারে। একা আমি নিজে 10 জন পুরুষের কাজ আমি নিজে একা করি আম্মাসুরা।
All right. Sorry about the audio for a second there. I guess we're all just having technical difficulties nowadays. But now we can jump into a bit of a conversation about the video, and whoever would like to start. Maureen, maybe?
Well, just to say that I think this repays revisiting this little video. I think, you know, Masura, she's definitely a role model to be celebrated. She's a woman with a sharp mind and a sharp tongue as well. And she manages to tell that story with such passion and wit, and in under 4 minutes, you know, she demonstrates actually the flaws in usual warning practice and the huge underused potential of women to protect themselves and others. And it's a really perceptive and succinct analysis of what gender and disaster scholars have wanted to say for decades. When she says women face 2 types of disaster, cyclone Amphan is a disaster and men are another disaster. So she's showing humor, but also she has now demonstrated herself as a role model and an encouragement of other women to come forward. And I think it's a really important video because of the way we used to use this single statistic from the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh and the huge numbers of women who died in that disproportionately in that cyclone. And this is a much more positive now, new piece of evidence, which points the way to much more positive direction, I think, for the future. And not just for Bangladesh, but I think we can all learn from this one.
Thank you, Maureen. Mr. Mohsen, would you like to add anything, the video being from Bangladesh?
Thank you very much. Actually, Maureen pointed out one point: 2 disasters. One is the natural disaster, another is, you know, the male person also disaster. But fortunately, we have overcome already this type of problem. I have mentioned that we have 76,000 dedicated volunteers, especially for cyclone. And out of these 76,000, 50% of them are now women. It's very important, women. And another issue I like to mention, I also mentioned in my presentation, and I add again that in 1970, there's a cyclone, 1 million people died. In that case, the ratio of male and female was 40:1. In 1991, it was 5:1. And nowadays, it is 2:, almost in some cases, 1:1. This is, I think, very good achievement for our country. And like Masura, there are many very smart lady. I have to say, very smart lady. Maybe they don't have any academic certificate, but really their humanitarian appeal is excellent. So this is my views finally. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Alice, would you like to add any of your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think I have a thought and a question. So the thing which really struck me about Mazur explaining her expertise was about the way that she recognized that men around her had framed her activities as authority versus care. So they said, you know, you should be at home caring for people, but implicitly she was reframing her activities as a form of care as well, that by going and taking on this really important role, she was able to care for a larger number of people and to have a bigger social impact. So it was really interesting that she was kind of turning that criticism against itself and really understanding and recognizing that that critique had the potential to open up into something that she could use as fuel and justification for her really important work. So the question that I wanted to ask was, I was so struck by the point that Maureen was making about the distinction between the technological and the social, but Mr. Massim was also talking about the role of the mobile phone in notifications and alerts. So I was wondering about whether there is a danger almost in thinking of the mobile phone as a kind of technological solution to the social aspects of warning, because it can be individual, it can be localized, and whether there's a danger that it tends to eclipse some of the really important work of social warnings and the social processes and infrastructure that would surround the last step of the warning process.
So, can I share? Another question was, and very much related with your question, that is the whole of society approach in our country. This is very much related to your questions. You know, that maybe 20 years before, it was the government, the whole of government approach. It means in case of any disaster, the government people or the official people, they'll go to the, the affected area, they'll help the people, this was. After that, government thought, no, it's impossible for the government because government personnel is not enough, the number is not enough. Then we started the community approach. There was a gap, and in that case even, only the community people, it means, it does not include the civil society and the other, this and that. Finally, for last 10 years, we are using the whole of society approach. It means everybody, whatever the government, whatever the non-government, even then the development partner, even then the community, everybody, we are very much involved with all this, especially, rescue, response, or preparedness. That is a very good strength for us, and we are getting a very good, result. And whatever you mentioned, that with the modern techniques, this is a very important, the social impact or the social approach or the, the social motivation or the social mobilization also important. So I think you can understand within a short time, this is the way we are using our approach. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for your responses. We have another question actually for Maureen. You emphasized the importance of warnings reaching those at risk. Would you agree that success depends more on the warning reaching those who are able to take action, which in those cases in some cases maybe those at risk? For instance, in the case of a flood, a warning to those able to operate protective measures may be more important than warning those who will be flooded if those measures fail.
Yeah, who can take protective measures? I think that's the question. And what exactly people can actually do, and just getting a warning is not enough, because then you have to think, well, what next? And of course, one of the major problems, not just in Bangladesh, elsewhere as well, but was, well, what choice do you get when there is a knock at the door or any other indication that you need to act, you need to, particularly if you need to evacuate, and you may not want to go to, or you may not be allowed to go to a shelter, or the shelter may not be appropriate for your needs. So it's quite a complex web, you know, and picking up Alice's point about the mobile phone, you know, and the role of the mobile phone. The mobile phone is just one, I think, one measure out of so many. So it's not a question that we just focus on the one, whether that's, you know, going to be appropriate or not, sufficient or not. It's all part of the whole package. And I think it's just thinking about the whole package that is important. So getting the warning, but then yes, who can actually act upon it? Can you save yourself, or can you save others? Can somebody save you? It's quite complicated social interaction going on there.
Thank you, Maureen. That was a great answer. And I mean, we're pretty much at the end now. So if anybody wants to add any, like, would you like to each just say something real quick, like what takeaways we want to take from this? If you could have like one quick statement. Maureen, you want to go first?
I think I've probably said enough now. I think I've made my points. I'll give my time to the others.
All right, Alice.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think the only thing I would want to say would be in defense of thinking about cultural objects as a way of conceiving of warnings. I guess one thing I didn't touch on, which really picks up on what Maureen was saying, was about the role of an audience or of a spectator or reader, because we're almost forced into a position of passivity when we receive a warning by from a text or an art object. So we can feel maybe demotivated or feel as though we've had our agency taken away, and that might lead us to reflect on the experience of being given a warning and not being able to act on it.
Thank you. And Mr. Mohsen.
Yes, I think that this is very important to really communicate to the local people, the warning, the message, you know, according to their local dialogue. It is really important what we are facing now. Maybe in the radio and television, we use maybe the official language, but they don't understand. So it is very important, I say again, that is send the message to them, you know, using their local dialogue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This has been such an insightful panel session. So now I think we'll hand it off to Carina. Sorry, we went over just a bit, but thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. It's been an absolutely brilliant session, and we thank you so much for taking your time and joining us, Mr. Machine, in your evening. We very much appreciate that. We understand you must be incredibly busy with all that's going on right now, but thank you to all our panelists and also to Simone for chairing. So thank you very much. We're now going to have a tea break until 2:30, so we've got about 10 minutes or so. So please do stretch your legs, grab a cup of tea or whatever you wish, and we hope to see you in 10 minutes back here. We'll just be doing a couple of sound checks for the next session, but we hope that you will enjoy our next session, where we'll be taking that perspective on art and looking at visual representations of warnings and engaging with a number of designers and artists to look at that. So it should be really interesting, another very interesting session coming up. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome back after your break. We have got a very exciting session now on the visual representations of warnings. So without any delay, I shall hand over to our excellent second intern over this summer from the University of Glasgow. It's Calum Mackay, who will be talking a little bit about his own research and introducing our amazing speakers for this session. So please do enjoy.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you for a really good session so far. My name is Calum Mackay, and I've been a research intern here at the WRC. And today I'm glad to welcome you to our second session of today's event. This session is going to focus on the visual depictions of disasters in art and society. And it'll be a discussion between our four exciting panel members centered around the importance of engaging communities with warning systems via art in its multiple forms. and how to best visually represent warnings across the board. The session will end in a Q&A session from the audience to our panel members. But before I introduce the members of our panel, I thought I'd give you guys a brief overview of some of the research I've been doing for the WRC. So I'm just going to share my screen, try to find the right one. Yeah, okay. So my main project as a research assistant has been collating a report slash bibliography that demonstrates the visual and cultural depictions of warnings to hazards throughout human history. So this has looked at, involved looking at paintings of natural disasters throughout time, as well as researching like oral histories and mythologies that depict disasters and warnings that are like embedded within different cultures across the globe. And it looks at how these warnings have been transferred intergenerationally through like poetry, songs and stories, and how the mythologies from these cultures have then been used to create paintings and sculptures that are unique to each culture. So before introducing today's panel, I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of what I've been working on. So my first example is one that I found really interesting, is from the Native American culture and their responses to disasters. So Native American oral traditions are littered with several stories that describe huge earthquakes and tsunami-like flooding that followed after the earthquake. There's one particularly strong and destructive event that's had a huge influence on Native American cultures and has led to one traditional story being constantly retold during across generations. And the story is the Native American Thunderbird and Whale story. So the event that inspired it was a megathrust earthquake and tsunami that occurred along the Cascadia subduction zone on the west coast of America in 1700. So it was a devastating 8.7 to 9.2 magnitude earthquake, and a powerful tsunami followed it and devastated the Panchena Bay settlement at the southern end of Vancouver Island. So the event had such a devastating consequence for the peoples of that time that they tell this great mythological story of an ancient fight between the Thunderbird and whale to conceptualize what they'd already experienced and to sort of warn future generations of the horrific impact of such an event and what to do if it were to ever happen again. So the story details the Thunderbird spirit and the whale spirit fighting, and this fighting causes the ground to shake and boulders to fall down the valley, also causes landslides. So this is obviously depicting the earthquake part of the story. And they also talk about the Thunderbird's wings causing like a massive booming sound across the land as it flapped its wings. So that's the sound you hear like during the earthquake event, and the roar of the tsunami wave that's about to come at them. And so in response, the whale thrashed about in the ocean, and it causes the ocean to sharply retreat, revealing the exposed seafloor. And then that was followed by a series of huge waves, which caused severe flooding and inundation in the land. So it washed canoes deep inland and wiped out the village in the Panchea settlement, leaving only one survivor. So the story details that survivor was a young woman who was actually watching from high ground on a hill. So, you know, this shows that this was an earthquake event and a tsunami. It details how to deal in a tsunami event when the earth shakes and the water recedes. You should go to a higher ground. So it not only inspired mythology, but it also inspired a common pattern of regional art depicting the two spirits fighting each other. And that's been represented in paintings, sculptures, and totem poles. So as you can see on my slides here, you have the Thunderbird fighting with the whale and carrying it away in its claws when it wins the battle. So this oral tradition and the art that accompanies it has acted as a warning for future generations about the devastation of earthquakes and tsunami floodings, whilst also giving advice on how to stay safe during event. Interestingly, thanks to the research on these oral stories and that art, this earthquake event was actually linked to a deadly tsunami in Japan that occurred at the same time. It actually killed thousands of people in Japan as it took them by surprise. There was no earthquake prior towards it, so it was known as an orphan tsunami. So because of the oral story that we have from the Native American culture, we're able to actually link these two events and have a cause and effect for the earthquake and tsunami and the tsunami that hit Japan as well. Moving on to Japan generally, they have a really in-depth disaster culture in their history, and it's another interesting example that I found during my research. So they have these things called tsunami stones, which are like centuries old monuments littered across their landscape. So Japan's got a long history of living alongside environmental hazards and disasters such as tsunamis and earthquakes. and it's led to their culture being deeply intertwined with the events themselves. And it's created a culture that's built upon warnings and preparedness for disasters that works across generations. And the tsunami stones are a key example of this. Many of the stones are actually lit across the forested areas and village areas of the coastline, and it acts as a reminder for the locals for previous tsunamis that have already occurred and their devastating impacts. The carved stones detail how many casualties there were from each village and instructed people how to stay safe during a tsunami event by running to high ground. The stones act as a stark reminder and a memorial for the modern day Japanese of how powerful the waves have been in the past. They also designate areas that are prone to tsunami flooding, and in one example, they've acted as a marker for how high the water's previously gone. So the stone will say, don't build above, below this stone, otherwise it will be flooded. Sadly, however, in the 2011 tsunami, many of these stones had actually been forgotten about or ignored, and many Japanese people instead placed their faith in the new modern seawalls and warning technology that they had. But sadly, all of these walls were breached anyway. And one village actually managed to avoid huge flooding from 2011 because they paid attention to the tsunami stone and they stayed above the flood line that the stone told them not to build below. So, these stones kind of demonstrate the importance of art and sculpture in disasters and warnings, and it also shows the importance of paying attention to previous warnings that have been communicated to us by our ancestors. Because if you fail to learn from your history, you are doomed to repeat it, is something that I thoroughly believe. So these are just a few examples of my research and shows clearly how art and cultural traditions like oral stories and sculptures can effectively act as an intergenerational warning system for communities that are at risk to environmental hazards. So that was the end of my kind of session. So I thought I'd move you on to the rest of today's panel. So we've got some really exciting and insightful guests for our discussion. On our panel today, we have Karen Holmberg, who's a visiting assistant professor at the University of New York. She specializes in volcanology and disaster perception. We also have Jamila Mikuin, an interdisciplinary environmentalist artist who's also based in New York. So thank you both for attending with the different time difference, really appreciate it. We also have Saskia van Menen, who's an independent researcher and co-founder of the Design Network for Emergency Management. And finally, we have Deborah Dixon, who's a professor of geography at the University of Glasgow, who I know very, very well. I just want to say welcome everyone. And if we'd like to start to provide your insights on your practices and your experiences around warnings and disasters, and how you engage with them in your work on art, and how we can engage communities with disasters and warning systems. So first, I'd like to start with Karen, please, if that's okay. Oh, you're on mute, Karen.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for doing this and organizing this overall, and for having me. Archaeologically, I tend to deal with the intersections of prehistoric rock art as a way of marking landscapes in contexts of repeated volcanic eruptions. The volcano for me encapsulates this dynamic and agency-filled earth, which is source of not only destruction, but also regeneration and life itself. I feel that art, along with the stories and the narratives, which Calum, you did a good job of highlighting, make it meaningful at its time of creation, can then transform and morph over its lifespan, but can still carry information that's important. It's a way of not only encapsulating a past event or experience, but to speaking to the future through it. So I don't feel that this is relegated only to the prehistoric past. It's very much active and pertinent to our contemporary context of environmental hazard and anthropogenic climate change. So when Carina asked me to send in an image to go along with my reflection, I sent off this one. It's Fire from 1987 by David Wojnarowicz. It's an image that I've used as my Zoom background for the past year or so, and it's also on the syllabus and the website for my interdisciplinary course, Volcanoes, the Sublime and the Scientific. I fell in love with it when I first saw it at some point in the 1990s, and I was sort of tickled when Carina asked if she could use it as an image for the event overall, and that said a lot to me. I use this image because I like the centrality of the volcano and its metaphorical use for risk, right? But it's also, it's very New York City specific, right? David was an artist during the AIDS era of the 1980s and early 90s. So his work is very much entailed with the gay men's health crisis, New York being its epicenter, and NYU, where I teach, holds his archive in something called the Artist Archive Initiative and the David Wojnarowicz Knowledge Base for Interdisciplinary Research. But internationally, chances are at some point you've seen his face, you know it, particularly through these images that I've got on this slide. Both were created not long before his death from AIDS in 1992. He has a larger resonance over time and place outside of just the crisis that he was particularly engaged with and dealing with. So the UCL initiative that brings us here today is about engaging community. Wojnarowicz did this as an artist, particularly through, say, protests by conservatives and the right wing against his work. Sure, that's galvanizing community, but his images still speak to us, whether we know anything about the context of why his art was created or not. So those of us here today are thinking about environmental risk. Wojnarowicz's fire piece is part of a quartet, just for background, about the 4 elements. They each depict an ecological Armageddon, although there's a lot more going on as well. The social context, this is water, this is wind, and to return us to earthly disasters, this is earth. So coming back to fire again, as the New York Times article opens about his 2018 retrospective at the Whitney Museum called "History Keeps Me Awake at Night." Like a guardian angel, the American artist David Wojnarowicz was there when we needed him politically 30 plus years ago. Now we need him again. So I guess what I'm wanting you to pull out of this is that forms of creativity become integral in times of transformation. And there's an intersection between contemporary art or prehistoric art with what is happening at the time. And this should engage with the sciences, particularly in this contemporary moment of anthropogenic climate change, to better convey environmental understandings and risk perception. So what matters over time? What understandings last? How do we think of the future while commemorating events of the past? I've been working the past few years in Chaiten, Northwest Patagonia. Very unexpected eruption, unexpected because they were not aware that Chaiten was a volcano until it erupted. Rhyolitic eruption, first in a century, quite rare. Everyone evacuated in 2 days, and yet it was still a very traumatic experience for the residents who lost their homes, for people who were in sort of environmental refugee status effectively for several years before coming back, and now as they're trying to resettle the community. One of the things that happened in the resettlement efforts was the discovery of a prehistoric rock art cave, which is built into a coastal cave complex in a volcanic plug. It is directly underneath the Chaiten volcano. There's a lot of evocative things going on here with a very dynamic planet in terms of thinking through the changes that the people who used this cave in the past saw during their generations of use of this. So I'm doing a lot of standard archaeological work and recording in this cave, stones and bones, a lot of standard dirt archaeology, pulling up artifacts, writing them up. And yet that's probably not what's going to resonate on a larger scale, so much as the photogrammetry and drone work and 360 work that we've been doing. This is Andres Burbano from Bogota in this picture with me. He is a new media wizard and was integral in this work. And it's this imagery that is evocative to people, which carries the stories of Chaiten out to a larger community, particularly through this Critical Zones exhibition that's up at ZKM right now. curated by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel. It has reached, and I could put links for some of the imagery from this at the end of this, just dump them into the chat. This is the larger kind of outreach that the science is able to be extended or sort of carry those stories of what we're learning from the data to a larger audience. And art, and something I won't have time to touch on properly, art has been important as art therapy for the resettled residents, dealing with how they felt with the evacuation, how they felt with the return, the resettlement. This is something that the University of Chile psychologists have been doing both in 2013 and 2019 with residents, and it is fascinating. This is something I really want you to be aware of. There is a brand new museum, largely through the amazing efforts of Connie Gomez from Procultura. This is at the site of the Lahar destruction of the town of Chaitén. They have built a museum that is not only meant to commemorate that 2008 eruption and the resilience of the residents who are resettling the community, but also the prehistoric context of very long-term intersections with volcanic eruption, and then thinking towards future risk and hazard. And importantly, they have a center, so tuck this away in your brain, a part of the museum that is specifically designated for artists or scientists to come and stay and do residencies. So again, it's a way of communicating the past volcanic eruption and the human experience, but it's also a way to speak to the future. It's not backward looking, it's forward looking. So recently, as in like the past week or two, a magazine called Art Papers published part one of an interview that was done with me a very long time ago, I think 3 years. So it's been a long time in the making. And they didn't let me take a look at the images they were choosing before they put it out. It was all sort of a surprise when it came out. And I think it's kind of interesting that they use a picture of Pompeii. I was interviewed for hours and hours about this work in Patagonia and the rock art and the archaeology and the resettlement. It is Pompeii that they choose as the opening sort of entry point to this discussion. And I guess that dog from Pompeii is incredibly evocative, sort of this empathy for the past that it allows you and creates. But this line, these images can still speak to us, I think is fascinating, because that's what the prehistoric rock art does for people, this kind of enigmatic conveyance of a message, but still there's a message, even if its clarity is lost. It sort of tweaks the brain and allows you to think and forces you to think, which then sort of leads us into new work that I'm sort of loving right now in Naples, Italy, with Campi Flegrei, and your own UCL Chris Kilburn is the driving force behind this wave spice, warnings and alerts during volcanic emergencies, scientific practices informed by community experience. And through this sort of intersection with local artistic groups, heritage groups, the importance of poetry, the importance of painting, the importance of dance, all these different ways of conveying not only these distant disasters, but in the Pozzuoli area of Naples, west of Naples, this very traumatic evacuation that occurred in 1970, where there was a belief that something large was going to happen. The residents were evacuated in a very sort of heavy-handed way and are still feeling the ramifications of that. So dealing with all of these different layers of deep time events along with these contemporary events, and how do you merge them all into one larger narrative? So I am the co-director of something called the New York Virtual Volcano Observatory. It is sort of an art science outreach space on Governor's Island, which if you've not been to New York, Governor's Island is a small island just south of the tip of Manhattan. It takes about 5 minutes by ferry, and it's this growing center of the arts and environmental study. And in this virtual volcano observatory, we cannot do virtual reality right now because of COVID. So we've built a big sphere that we are then projecting through then a smaller mirror sphere, and the projection bounces off and shoots out drone imagery from Campi Flegrei, drone imagery of the recent Icelandic eruptions, and amazing work by Jamila McEwen, who's one of my favorite artists in the world and who's speaking to you next. And Jamila, I hope you're not going to kill me, but I'm showing pictures I didn't vet past you first. But this is Jamila looking at the installation. This is still not in its final process, but this is a piece that I love very deeply that's on display right now, that I will let her speak to more capably for. And that, I think, is all that I've got. Now, just to finish with the point that Calum asked for us to answer, how can we engage communities with disasters and warning systems through art? And my answer would be evocatively, across time and space, and in ways that draw on science but are not confined within it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a really interesting talk, particularly the points about Pompeii. When I've been doing my research, Pompeii is the one visual depiction that consistently comes up again and again, whether it's in sublime art from the 1800s to Andy Warhol in the 60s or the 70s. Like, it is something that is always there, and that was really interesting. Thank you very much. So moving on to our next panel member, we have Saskia van Mennen. If you'd like to share your screen, please, Saskia. Oh, yeah, there you go. You have to unmute yourself, Saskia.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you are now.
Fab. All right. First of all, I'd really like to congratulate Carina and Ilan and the rest of the colleagues for founding the UCL Warning Research Centre. I think it will be able to provide very timely and important research and insights that we desperately need to bridge academia and practice and communities, because they are ultimately the people that matter, especially when they find themselves at the end of warning. So to prepare myself for today, Calum gave us 2 questions to think about. And I really just thought, you know, the session today overall, this launch event, is focusing on the meaning of warnings. And that really brought me to the Cambridge Dictionary. I thought, let's go back to basics and have a look at what they say. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as something that makes you understand there's a possible danger or problem, especially one in the future. And it seems such a straightforward, short definition, but then I think it already reveals a lot of the complexity that warnings actually entail. And if we unpick that a little bit further, you know, these 5 words really struck me, especially one in the future. Which future? Is that 5 minutes from now? Is that an hour from now? Is that days, weeks, or months? And actually, it is all of these. And we're going to need a lot of technology still to understand what the warning signals are, and then to be able to transfer these into an actual warning that reaches the communities at risk. And as Mami Mitzdori said last week, we will never be able to fully predict the future. And of course, this is a definition. It is not a warning message in itself. So the fact that the timing here is very unclear is totally okay. And that's where we need that technology. But that also brings back Ilan's words from last week, which are that warnings are too often seen as being about data and technology, and they're fundamentally social. And I totally agree with that. They are about people, and it's about people as individuals, as individuals and collectively. And this is why I think design as a discipline is so important to bring on board in the world of disaster risk reduction and warning research, because design is all about people. It's all about people putting yourself in another person's shoes, being empathetic towards them, and thinking how you individually would feel if you were at the end of a warning. And what would that warning look like? And that brings me back to the first part of this definition of warning, really that word of something. And something seems so incredibly vague, and yet it is so apt, because warnings come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they target a single of our senses or a multitude of our senses. And think, for example, about a siren. It's a warning signal. It's something we can hear. But smoke is another warning signal that we can actually smell often before we can even see fire. Now, seeing as the session's about visual representations is really where I want to go next, because most often when we look at warnings, what we get to see is a visual. And visual infrastructures include text, because that's also a visual representation of information. And yet, even if this is the main way in which we're conveying warnings, basic graphic design principles and rules of legibility, for example, they're simply not used, and they're not taught in the emergency planning process, skill set, or training. And they're also not taught to scientists. I mean, we get to, so I come from a very scientific background, and we don't get taught how to necessarily communicate well. And communicating and relaying information in this manner attributes to poor compliance and or non-compliance. So why are visuals so important? Now, about 65% of the human population are visual learners. So that's really the majority. And even though we can interpret information and receive information via all of our senses, visuals stimuli travel the fastest, and therefore they can help us have greater comprehension of a situation at a time of emergency. And also our brain processes visual information, according to the 3M Corporation, 60,000 times as fast as we deal with other types of stimuli. So this really means that visuals can help us clarify a situation, as well as capture our attention and motivate us. Now, if we go and look at what the basic principles are, and this is really stripping it down to basics, is we have these 4 basic elements to play with when we're talking graphic design for emergencies. And let's start with lines. Lines connect 2 points. They can define the boundaries of shapes. They can create textures. They have width, they have orientation. And like I said, they can form shapes. And if we look at the arrow there, that's a very interesting shape in itself. I actually thought about doing this entire presentation just about arrows, but then I thought that might be a little too specific, because this arrow is clearly showing us which way it wants us to move. Complications start to arise if you have an arrow pointing up. You will see that in many airports, also train stations, but the arrow pointing up, does that mean you have to go upstairs? Does that mean you have to go straight ahead? And different cultures will interpret these arrows in their different directions in different ways. So arrows in themselves are a very interesting area. Now, besides shapes such as arrows, we have colors, of course, and we see that reflected in color codes, warning systems, but also colors are great for gathering our attention. You know, red always stands out, as does orange and yellow, whereas green and blue are generally sort of considered calm shades. And then typography, I've listed here as a separate thing that I think is really a basic element. In essence, typography is lines, but the choice of font is very, very important when you are designing a warning message. Different fonts actually have different levels of trust that they elicit in people. Different fonts also affect how readable something is. And also, for example, if you have a more complicated font and somebody takes the time to read it, they'll comprehend that information for longer. However, they might not have the time to do so in an emergency. So these are really basics, but you need to know what you are doing in putting these basics together in order to make a clear warning message. And then I'm not even talking about the context of the message or the content of the message yet. Now, these basic elements form basic principles to come together in these, and we have something called unity, gestalt, and space. So unity, and we see all of these actually reflected in this single image here, in that unity means that these elements belong together. All of these lines, all of these shapes here clearly represent a circle. That is gestalt. Together, we see that circle. And space, white space, which in this image I have to admit is gray, actually helps us create some space to breathe, also when we're reading things visually. So, and then that space, that decreasing of visual noise is really important when we're trying to really get essential messages out there. And so if you combine these, you can make a visual standard that you can then apply to various things. Now, something else that I really want to mention is that when we are making designs, it's all too easy, especially when we're under pressure, to forgo testing. And yet testing is absolutely essential when we're creating visuals. It's so that we know whether the visual that we've created actually manages to perform the way that it should or that we want it to. And what you see here, for example, is the testing from an icon set named Gamil, and I'll get back to that in the next slide. And what they do is they develop icons for emergencies and they test them with a global audience. And you can see here in the slide the various percentages of understanding. So the first one, I think, should be as a man, and 71% of the audience that's participated in testing understood this to be a man rather than maybe a person or people. And that means that in the world of Gamil, this icon ideally is not used because they're looking for an 83% or higher understanding of their, or 93% or higher understanding of the icons. So as I said, Gamil, it's open source. If you go to the website, you can download it. For as far as I know, it's the only tested icon set out there in the world. And it's really interesting if you look into some of their research, what the regional differences also are in terms of understanding. And that, of course, then should influence which icons we do use, do not use, how we combine them, etc., from a design perspective. Now, I mentioned earlier, if you combine all the basic visual elements that we have to play with in graphic design, you can get a sort of standard. Now, if you apply a visual standard, it's almost like a form of branding. If you think about Coca-Cola, for example, they have this iconic red, they have this iconic swirly font. You'll recognize them literally anywhere in the world, and you'll recognize them from quite a distance. However, if we look at the world of disaster risk reduction and emergency management, if we look here, we have some images of evacuation maps. These are from the US, from a variety of places, and they're very data-driven, they're very content-heavy, they have lots of detail and very specific coding that requires a certain skill set and understanding to read these maps. And most people in their everyday lives, believe it or not, are not poring over maps of scientific information that they may or may not use during a disaster. And so if this is your evacuation map and you have no experience reading this, this is going to be really, really difficult for you. Now, if you apply a visual standard, like my colleague Claudine has done using the Tsunami Clear standards, what you get are maps that look more like the ones on the right. And if you just Google Tsunami Clear, you'll find a lot more examples of that. It's even been expanded now to be to also extend to fires, wildfires, for areas that are more land inwards. So this is Southern California. And it's a visual grammar in a way, and applying this standard across various towns in Southern California, and it's growing and growing and growing where this is, also means that people don't have to learn a new visual language when they move from one town to another. If they go to the beach in Laguna Beach, or whether they go to the beach in Long Beach, it doesn't matter. The emergency maps look all the same. They've only got to learn this one set of visual information, how to navigate that. And these maps, actually, believe it or not, are not used, are not intended to be used at the time of a tsunami. They're actually intended to trigger the user to think about developing an alternative cognitive map of an area that they can then use to refer back to in an emergency when they need to maybe take a different route or step out of their routine. And the reason that it's actually so important to start thinking about warning messages and how they're going to be perceived way before we actually have to put a warning out there, and this is why I think warning systems are such a good phrase in a way, is that our cognitive state as humans, when we're under stress, we lose perspective. There's a couple of cognitive phenomena that take place. You can get tunnel vision, you can get temporary cognitive paralysis where you simply don't know what to do anymore. And so you will not be able to absorb any new information at a time like that. And this is why we need to talk to people and have them understand their options beforehand. And this is also why drills are very effective. So last week, there was also some talk about whether drills could be considered false alarms, but actually drills have been proven to be very effective because we are learning information at a time when we're relatively relaxed, depending on the setting. And I think one of the best examples of this is actually the airplane safety briefing. Most of us won't have flown for about 18 months now. but we'll still be able to recall parts of or all of the airline safety briefing and to put on your own mask before helping others. And that just goes to show that if we repeat these messages consistently enough and we design messages to be repeated in such a consistent manner, we can get there. And this also really brings me back to some of the words that Ilan said last week, and let me just read them out to you. It was, warning systems should not be separate from daily life to be invoked only when a threat manifests. Instead, warning systems can support people in their everyday activities to improve life and livelihoods. So that really goes to show also that besides being a social thing, warnings should be part of a much larger picture, and they are much part of a larger picture, one where we consider informational and instructional and preparedness messaging to residents, businesses, schools, tourists, etc., and all members of the community, way before an event even happens. We have to familiarize them with these symbols, with the terminologies long before. And so that gets me back to thinking, really, what is a warning? And a warning is a decision point. It is one at which you are made to stop. You're prompted to stop, either by a visual, which should be the focus of this, or by an audible signal or whatever. But it makes you get out of your specific routine. It makes you evaluate the information that's available to you at that very moment, and combine that with your pre-existing knowledge in order to evaluate what you're going to do next. And that means that a warning needs context and a basic awareness of your surroundings. So if we take the principles, processes of design, what we can do is we can start bridging the gap between scientific information that's available in the various timeframes before disaster and subsequent intended actions at the recipient's end. And most often this recipient is the public in general. And one of the questions that Calum posed was, how do we engage communities? And I think the way to engage communities is, one of the ways to engage communities, I should say, is through design. Because it's a connective discipline that's characterized by really systematic solution finding, building, and it uses creative tools. And it's through these creative tools that we can really bring people together. So one of the things that I've done in my work is on Volcan Turrialba in Costa Rica, hosted these co-design workshops to look at reducing disaster risk in the area, but also evaluate perception of disaster risk. And it's through these workshops, through just simply getting together, sitting down and thinking through and working through a number of these design type exercises, that people came to insights and conclusions. And I think the other really important contribution that design can bring is that empathy. And we're really trying to understand the audience, and rather than segmenting an audience, if they are segmented by sort of age, education, et cetera, we're really looking at their psychographic profile. So what are their barriers? What are their motivations? What are their perceptions? And how can we attune to that? But also what might be their accessibility requirements? Because even though the session is about visual, there are plenty of people that have no access to a visual, either through poor vision or through being blind, or even something as simple as color blindness is often overlooked when we're creating visuals for warnings or preparedness messaging. So I think I've pretty run over time, so let's leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, Saskia. Really enjoyed the stuff about the icons and the idea of people trusting different font sizes and different text. That was really, I never thought of that, but that was really interesting. So we'll move on to Jamila, who's going to do her talk now. Over to you, Jamila.
So first, it's Jamila.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Jamila, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Okay, so this is going to go in a little bit more of an esoteric direction because I am a visual artist. Hang on one sec. Sorry, I'm just having trouble getting it to go onto slideshow mode when it's in this presenter.
If you're on slideshow, play from the start, just in the top left.
Top left. Oh, cool. Thank you. All right. So I'm a visual artist, and what's kind of strange about that is actually a lot of what I'm doing as an artist in the field is not actually visual to me. It's a much more internal process. And so I guess my area of research is as a human in the field of the world. And I set up parameters for what I learn and experience through altered states of the usual parameters, so that I can kind of understand a little bit more about our humanity and how we are in the world. So I'm just going to run through a few slides with actually giving you zero information about what's happening in these, but just kind of letting some of the, I guess, like absurdity of how I kind of take in information through performance sort of sink in. So this first piece is called Casa. This was a work in Mexico. This piece is called Maiden Grass Voyage. This was a performance I did in Manhattan with my body augmented with grass. This piece is called A Taming, and it was a work about touch in which I was naked under a cowhide and people would engage with me in experiences of touch. And onto volcanoes. So another thing that I do when I'm applying this process of kind of taking in input, I also take in input from material. So I worked on a ceramic series of volcanoes that where these pieces were really made by imagining the clay, well, actually really listening to the clay and letting the clay tell its story, its origin story as being at one point igneous rock through my hands. The process of firing these pieces is in a wood fire kiln. We take the raw clay up to the same temperatures as magma, which turn it back into igneous rock. So this might seem kind of in a long branch from where we just were in terms of symbols and images, and this really is another way of kind of really slowly allowing the world to percolate into one's knowledge, so that you can have actually a deeper, more empathetic knowledge of the material reality around you. So it's almost the opposite of symbols. And basically, what I find interesting about this process is by sitting and stoking a fire for 5 days, it actually gives you a very tangible, real experience with heat and fire and the violent transformation that happens in these processes. And I think often when it comes to science communication, the physical realities and the material realities of these animate forces that are from the more than human world become abstracted to the point where we don't even have a sense of just how powerful and potent they are. So when I'm working on these volcanic sculptural pieces, a lot of what I am translating is the power of these forces and the violence of them. And some of them are really ripped apart. And so it becomes evocative in a way that is much more emotional. It's much more engaging of not just the deeper senses, but also our instincts. So when and I love that, Karen, the image of Pompeii came up, and, I was in your Pompeii and Vesuvius class, and one of the ways that I worked with Karen's students with the Pompeii and Vesuvius images was actually to unflatten them as images. So that classic iconic image of the twisted dog, I grew up seeing that as a young child, but it wasn't until I saw in person the cast of that dog in real life that I was really shook, and it transformed me to my core, and I felt it in my bones in a way that I could never forget it. So with my work, it's really, the visual is one thing, but actually it's getting inside material, it's getting inside the how it moves us that I'm kind of interested in. So this is the piece that Karen was referring to that's in the virtual volcano laboratory. And this work is called Who. It is named, the name is actually from a Sufi word that means the breath of existence. So the way that you say it is like who. So you're pushing the sound out from the base of your stomach, and in doing that, it engages you in a recognition that breath is the grounding force of life. And so this piece, which is the ring, the outer representative of the outer ring of the crater, is that feeling coming from the center of the earth. So we can actually engage people in, say, volcanic disasters as not just disasters, but as animate forces of our planet that are also very beautiful. We can actually bring people's imagination into a place of curiosity, which I think is also, you know, scientists and artists both agree that curiosity is a defining feature in how we can actually have people engaged more deeply and to take things in more thoroughly. And so to bring a kind of a spiritual dimension into our understanding of the animate earth, I think that way we're bringing people's instincts and intuitions online in a way that we can't actually quantify that. We can't predict it exactly. But I think that we need to return to a kind of a trust that actually human beings are very evolutionarily complex, and that if we neglect the instinctive and we neglect the intuitive and we neglect a deeper spiritual connection to what is happening, then actually we just turn people into kind of panicked and non-participant entities. I wanted to, oh, sorry, hang on. I thought I deleted that video from this. I wanted to bring up this David Bowie quote because I thought of it this morning. So one thing that I, as an artist, I'm working with is also how little time and resources people are given to actually emotionally process the disaster that we are already in, and that disaster is slowly unfolding, and that we're witnessing parts of it day by day, and it's extremely fatiguing. And I was given permission from my therapist a few years ago to stop watching the news, because they pointed out to me that the way that the news is delivered is that it is not taking responsibility for the psychological impact. And part of it is, if you're receiving extremely complex news and yet there's no acknowledgement that this news is painful, or the extreme amount of loss that one feels when confronting, say, issues of mass extinction, then we feel kind of lost. You know, you're kind of landed with this news. There's no community. You're often receiving it alone, on your phone, on the subway, these kinds of things. And what I love about this, I'll read it out, this line from David Bowie: "The news guy wept and told us Earth was really dying. Cried so much his face was wet. Then I knew he was not lying." And I don't need to explain why that's a kind of really powerful image, but it's that if we can actually bring emotional truth into how we talk about these things, we actually bring people online in terms of trusting and connecting. So in this scenario, it's like David Bowie is actually empathetically connecting to the newscaster, and it's not the information that gets through to him, it's the emotional devastation from a person that is supposed to be typically very stoic. I'm gonna skip that that video. Currently, what I'm working on this year, I'm also like, I was very moved by these tsunami stones that you talked about, Calum, and I think about my own work as stretching back to a tradition that extends all the way to the Neolithic. And the work that I'm currently working on is a project called Dead Gods, in which I'm resurrecting prehistoric super fungi that are long since extinct, but their story of extinction is actually incredibly evocative in terms of our understanding of where we are now and how to trust the animate world beyond the human, which in this case is the fungi. So I'm reanimating what were super fungi with their contemporary ancestors. This was an experiment that I did in residency with the Virtual Volcano Laboratory last year on Governor's Island, and we had these blooms, and it brought people into a deeper conversation about extinction and extinction as a slow process, and also a process that happens again and again and again. And extinction is actually a theme in a lot of my work. This is a film that I made that was really about processing environmental grief. This is by way of talking about how even myth, and actually I love that you were talking about how mythology became a carrier for stories of disasters. And I think one thing that I would think about is how to create a contemporary mythology that could actually take us through this present moment and maybe speak to the future. So this is a film that I made in Iceland about environmental grief. This story was told to me by the land. It is not my story, but I was an agent of retelling it. And in this story, you can see me in the middle, I'm the protagonist, and I'm tasked with this responsibility of carrying these glacial wisdom teeth, caretaking these glacial wisdom teeth, which have become dislodged from the glacier body. As the glacier melts, its wisdom teeth have become dislodged. And I go through all these kind of human egoic moments of like kind of this Shackleton type imagery of like being a heroic, intrepid explorer into, the wilderness. But at a certain point, it's actually, I have to succumb to the limits of my humanity. And in this moment, one of the teeth actually, they've been mute up until this point, and one of the teeth speaks to me in Icelandic, and the tooth is actually voiced by an 8-year-old girl that I had play this role. And the tooth allows me to kind of accept the limits of what my role is actually in this disaster, and kind of teaches me about what my humanity is from the perspective of the more than human world. This is
Jamila, sorry, we're kind of running out of time a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. So just to skip through, this is a much bigger project that I did that was about emotional processing of shame, and this is a work called Human Meteorite, in which I dug a meteor crater for 30 days, putting myself in a sentient role of what has been like is in our imaginations like the driver of major extinction. So and this was broadcast every day live, and people kind of came along with me in that journey. And the point of this is that it takes actually slow process to get through these emotions and to bear witness and to be sort of truthful in this space. And that is the last project. So I can stop screen share.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for pushing you for time at the end there.
No.
I'll just move on to Deborah. I don't think we might not have time for that many questions at the end, but I'll just move on to Deborah now. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. Can I just check that screen is showing?
Yep, that's showing.
Marvelous. And it's a real pleasure to be part of the opening events for this UCL-based Warning Centre. So thank you to Carina for the invitation and to Calum for setting the agenda for this session. And my comments today are primarily a response to the task posed by Calum, and that is to talk about my practice around warnings and disasters and how I engage with these in my work. And my research focus might be summarized as the future work of warning. Not, I should emphasize, the future of warnings, but rather the work that this idea of warning does in regard to shaping how we imagine futures. And so my subtitle for today is Purple. And looking at this color on screen and its association with warning might perhaps give some of you an indication of how I'm going to exemplify the kind of work that I do. And that is, I'm going to talk about an event concerning temperature and color. And what I want to do is use this event to draw out some of the complicated work in the world around futures that warning does. And I'm going to do so using inspiration from the arts and humanities, as these provide a critical approach to how terms such as warning are framed in word and image. So that is a critical take on the striving to fix these words and images of warning so that they operate as explanations and contextualizations, tools of power and subversion, and as expressions and prompts of emotion and sensibility. But what is more, such an arts and humanities approach is attentive to how expressions of warning slip away into something else, the unintended, the unexpected, the unwelcome, and the serendipitous. And my event is the remaking of a temperature bar by members of the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. So as an angry summer pitched up over this landmass in January 2013, the Bureau released a forecast for Monday the 14th, based on one of its models, that would take temperatures above the 48 to 50 degrees Celsius, which is the current top band, denoted by a crisp burnt black. And to accommodate this unprecedented anticipated temperature, the Bureau added a new color to the top of its scale, a violet purple that marks 50 to 52 degrees Celsius. So emerging from this burnt black, violet purple is incandescent, denoting a future land luminous with intense heat. To the right, in the color bar, the purple grows even brighter, providing a glimpse of a color that is termed vivid purple. So back to the drawing board, announced ABC News, not the most apt idiom, but resonant with today's session. Temperatures are off the charts, reported the Sydney Morning Herald, as Australia turns deep purple, a sign of things to come, noted The Guardian. The Independent firmly linked the temperature forecast to pictures of fire and scorched earth, kangaroos in distress, violet purple as a warning of things to come under global warming. And that link between heat wave and global warming was reiterated by Australia's then Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, visiting Tasmanian communities devastated by fires during this same heat wave. And she said, "We do know over time that as a result of climate change, we're going to see more extreme weather events and conditions." Now, a growing environmental arts and humanities literature and practice has emphasized the emotional and psychological impacts of an Anthropocene that foregrounds a series of endings, from the extinction of species to the curtailing of life on Earth, as well as a series of futures from survival to flourishing. What words and what images are, could, and perhaps should be used to describe the conditions we live in, the challenges we face, and the futures we want, and the futures we find ourselves in. Considering the event of purple, what kinds of warning are being enacted here? And perhaps most obviously, there's the idea of warning as cautionary advice aimed at changing actions in the present, the purple of Julia Gillard. The insertion of vivid purple here acts as a deterrent. It serves to discourage, inhibit, and perhaps even prevent, and acts as an exhortation to encourage, to persuade, to plead, we might say, for change. And as such, it has parallels with efforts in the arts and humanities to fashion a lexicon that addresses not only warming skies and oceans, but also mass degradation, precarity, and insecurity. In text such as an ecotopian lexicon, which offers a wealth of words and new configurations to delineate the Anthropocene, the work of words here is to clarify, diagnose, and stimulate action. These are words to stir passions, which in turn become a means of realizing desired futures. Our vivid purple, anticipated in the temperature bar, but not yet used, is an anticipatory mapping of global warming, to be sure, but is also an anticipatory mapping for futures built around acknowledging and addressing global warming, a call to action, if you will. But also we might consider this warning as an advanced notification, a tangible, sensible notice of what will intensify and proliferate. And this notice is itself embedded in the present. It's experienced, felt in the now, and as such has a history as well as geography. And what's the nature of this warning, this notice? The color and placement of a violet purple are there to be seen, and were seen, to be sure. But this violet purple crystallizes a radiation sensible in the air massing just above the land surface, a sensible radiation, both elemental and forced. This notice, this warning, does a different kind of work, one that does not offer a map of things to come or seek to stir passions towards the future. Rather, this warning evokes, somewhat in the vein of Italo Calvino's short story collection, Cosmicomics, a planetary history that winds its way tightly into the lives of people who have faced and will face unsettling losses, and who have generated and will generate new forms of solidarity and community. What survives an extinction event? What emotional and psychical as well as physical traces remain? What does it feel like to anticipate cataclysm and to experience the falling apart of words and images, of temperature bars that can no longer situate and orientate us? Officially, temperatures did not match this forecast on Monday the 14th. And so these extra colors were not used by the Bureau except in that heat wave forecast. Nevertheless, they have proliferated outside of their box. In 2017, Australia was once again doused in purple, this time in the vivid purple by the private company Higgins Storm Chasers. The color here is not actually denoting 50 degrees Celsius and above, a fact that the UN Climate Action Office belatedly caught up on, but it's there. Here we see vivid purple used by CBS News to indicate temperatures ranging from 97 to 114 degrees Fahrenheit, 36 to 45 degrees Celsius. This is a reading from June 27, just a few days ago. And we've gone from violet purple straight into incandescent white. And this escape brings me to the second question that Calum posed, which is how can we engage communities with disasters and warning systems through art? And that's a great question. But my own focus is on those same disaster and warning systems and scientists as part of communities and as a distinct community. What are our heat wave lexicons of word, image, color, icon, shape, sound, and feel? What warnings do they narrate and how? What do we want to narrate and how will we do this? And it might be said I'm reading too much into purple, adding an interpretive layer onto an action driven by someone tasked with adding 2 more color categories and selecting quickly from the software generated color options. My point though, is that these lexicons are always already read. They are always working as part of narratives that give meaning and affect. These warnings, the cautionary forecast, the advance notice that sears itself into the present, themselves dip into narratives such as the Gothic and the sublime, such that here, today, I've outlined a mere minute sliver of the work of purple. That's it, Calum.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That was a very interesting talk. I think we've only really got time for one more question. I want to thank you all for contributing so far in these thought-provoking discussions. So I think the question we're going to go for is, what do we think best constitutes a visual learner in terms of warnings? Like what best constitutes a visual learner? Oh, Karen, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm sitting here looking at your question in the chat, and I honestly don't know who's not a visual learner. I think that's why it's so important that you've put together this session. Like, we are all visual learners, and that is how we communicate. So I can't actually think of any other way to go about it. It's what conveys, not spreadsheets or data.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. Saskia, what are your thoughts?
I think the visual plays a really important role, but I think if we look at what Jamila was showing us, there's also a space for the experiential and perhaps even combinations of this. And then we got to some of the questions we're also asking, we get to virtual reality. And maybe that's also where we can go towards for visual learning and warnings.
Thank you very much. Jamila?
I think that we really need to engage people through all senses, and I think that we should not silo off the visual. And I think that when we're talking about the visual, we should actually think about the somatic. So anything that and I think what's interesting about that purple is that actually it has an emotional somatic effect. So we need to understand the visual as its somatic response.
Thank you very much. And finally, Deborah.
Well, I would just say that I have absolutely loved all the commentaries in this session. I think there is something of a fleshing out, not just of the visual, but of the sensory, the embodied, in a very social manner, which is something that Carina was, talking about in her introduction, but also in a manner that's attentive to the limits of the social. And so I'm particularly glad that mine followed on from the 3 before, because I really appreciated that, dissolution of the sense of the human into, this sort of the territory of the earth. So what I would just urge is that we take, comments on the visual that might come across as somewhat, added on or ephemeral or interpretive, and see how we can embed them in other areas of warning, research and practice, whether that be governance, whether that be policy making and so on, because they are absolutely vital.
Thank you very much. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming to today's event and listening to all the talks we've had at today's session. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. And I'll hand you back over to my colleague, Carina. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Calum, for that session, and thank you very much to our panelists for a wonderful session. And there's been some great comments in the chat, and indeed, it's really brought to the fore from many of your presentations around the feelings that we also feel around warnings and how emotive they are, which I think is definitely something we should pick up and look at going forward. So thank you very much for a wonderful session, and joining us from New York as well, Karen and Jamila. So thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a 15-minute tea break. So we'll come back at 5 to 4 o'clock. So just 15 minutes break. So we'll just be 10 minutes late on the agenda, but we can make that time up. So please do stretch your legs, grab a cup of tea or biscuit, whatever you need to do, and we'll see you in just under 15 minutes. And again, we might be doing some sound checks, so please ignore any noise that you hear. Thanks very much again. Hello everyone, and welcome back after your break. I'm sure if you're in the UK, a bit of tea and cake is needed because the weather is not very summery today at all. But I hope you had a good little break. So I'm delighted to be chairing our third session today, which is looking at putting warnings into practice. And really, this session is focusing on the development and implementation of warning systems, both in the UK and internationally, with a very particular focus of looking at the role that policy plays in establishing warning systems and the challenges of actually reaching effective communication across government and various other organisations that are working with government. We have three fantastic panel members today. We have Suzanne Rain, we have Catalina Jamie, and also Sophie Danruther. So I'll just provide a brief introduction before handing over to each one of our panelists who have been asked to reflect on a few questions today, and I hope will generate some discussion. So please, if you do have any questions, do pop them in the Q&A and we'll have some time to get back into those. So let's start off with Suzanne Rain, who's a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies and affiliated lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Suzanne has served for 24 years in the British Foreign Commonwealth Office, including postings in Poland, Iraq and Pakistan, and she specialises in counter-terrorism, holding a number of senior domestic appointments, including being head of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre from 2015 to 2017. I'd imagine that's always a pretty busy job. She is also trustee of the Imperial War Museum, the Royal United Services Institute and Stop the Traffic. So we're really delighted to have you here, Suzanne. So I'll hand it over to hear some of your thoughts today. Thank you.
Carina, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody at the UCL Warning Centre for creating this. It's lovely to be a part of it. It's lovely to be part of an all-woman panel, actually, and there's something I think somebody might study on the number of women who seem to be really interested in warning. I know there was some chat about bits of that. So thank you for having me. As Carina just said, my qualification for being here is that I was head of the UK's Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which is the government body which operates the UK's national threat level for terrorism. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that from my own experience, but I'm going to start off with a little bit about some broader thinking about warning that has come out of my experience. So JTAC was set up in 2003 to be the single independent and authoritative body in the UK government to provide assessment and analysis of the threat from terrorism and to operate the threat level system, so essentially a warning function. And it's a self-standing organisation comprised of representatives from 16 government departments and agencies, including the police, which is, I think, unique in the UK government system to have a body that has so many different departments as part of it. And it speaks with one voice on the threat from terrorism. The important thing is it operates that warning function as a part of a much wider warning system for terrorism, which goes across a large number of departments in the UK government. And stepping back a bit, I'm coming at the sort of the question of warning very much from a national security perspective. But one of the things that I think those of us who had been involved in national security, managing national security threats professionally, felt at the start of the pandemic was, where were the warnings? Where is the anticipation? And in many ways, it felt to us as though the challenges of warning about a pandemic were exactly the same as the challenges we've been facing warning about national security threats, but there just didn't seem to be a system in place. And I, since then, when I met Carina, it became clear to me that actually there's a lot of overlaps among all the different kinds of things, sort of threats, risks, hazards that we're talking about, in terms of how you might manage them. And so there's an awful lot more in common between terrorism warning and volcano warning than anybody might think. So it was great to sort of realize there's a community out there. We talk a lot, the language is a lot at the moment about uncertainty. These are uncertain times, but here are some certainties. Terrorists will surprise you, volcanoes will erupt, floods will inundate communities, hostile states will commit hostile acts, the economy will suffer shocks, cyber systems will be attacked, new diseases will rage out of control. And anxiety about uncertainty has become an orthodoxy, but I think we're being anxious about the wrong thing, because it's not whether these things are going to happen, but when. And if not knowing when creates the anxiety, then we need to focus instead on what kind of system might enable the best possible protection and preparedness to prevent the crisis from happening, or to make it seem less of a crisis when it does. So that's kind of my starting point. And I think for clarity, it helps to break down risks into, this is my own thinking, you may disagree, but into two categories. And category one, which is the category I'm going to talk about today, are those bad things which you don't want to happen, but you accept that it's not possible to prevent from happening every single time. So that is those things I just listed: terrorism, volcanoes, floods, attacks of any kind, sort of shocks in a way to a system that can't possibly run in the same way all the time. So the issue is how to develop a system of monitoring and warning such as that you can instantly flex to identify and respond. And that's the same for malicious action by hostile states as it is for, extreme weather. And then the second kind of risk, which I think is the kind of risk that Sophie's going to talk about later, are what has become called the extreme or existential risks, which are things that you never want to happen. So they are so cataclysmic that the only option is to design a system that is not designed to mitigate the risk when it happens, but to prevent it from ever happening. And I personally think that you can't do that through a risk register or the kind of alert and warning system that I'm talking about. I think you have to do it by having a plan and managing the risk to the delivery of the plan. But Sophie is the expert on that, and she will speak later. So for the first kind of risk, what you can call the predictably unpredictable bad things, I would start by acknowledging that they're probably going to happen sooner or later, even the low probability and high impact ones. And so the question is, what's the best system for dealing with it in policy terms, in a policy environment? How do you fit it all together? And we talk all the time now about resilience, the ability to absorb a shock, to adapt and emerge even more competitive than before. But we still aren't talking about how to get that posture right. So this is a UK example for those international people, but I think it's probably replicated in other areas in the world. In March this year, the UK government published an integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. So the aim is to do a big piece of strategic thinking and set out the parameters for how the UK is going to do defence, security and foreign policy. And I typed certain words into the sort of search bit at the top, just to see how many times they were used in this document, which has 111 pages. And the word risk is used on 40 of those 111 pages, and in some instances multiple times. The word resilience is used on 36 pages multiple times. And in contrast, the word analysis is used on only 12 pages and not always talking about analysis, just using the word. The word assessment used on 13 pages, and the word warning is not used at all in the document. And this is a crude metric, but I think it's a very striking one, because you cannot develop resilience against risks if you can't warn that they're about to happen. So we've just done a big piece of thinking and we haven't talked at all about warning. So that doesn't mean we don't do it. It means that it's just not in the lexicon of the government at the moment when they're thinking about how to manage risk. So more about the terrorism warning system. Nothing is perfect. So I am not saying that the UK government's terrorism alert system is perfect, but I do think that the whole system and how the threat level is operated within that is a good example of something that works smoothly in practice. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the UK has a 5-step threat level system for the terrorist threat, which is pretty much a standard kind of threat level system. So it goes from low, moderate, substantial, severe, and critical, and it has a definition beside them. That is accessible on the internet. It is deliberately simple. You still might say it's, I mean, simplicity is also complicated because you have to then work out what it actually means. But below that, there is, of course, a whole set of different criteria which are available to the analysts, which are used behind the scenes to sort of understand what they all mean. But the communication for the public is these 5 words, and critical means, for example, an attack is highly likely in the near future. So there is a temporal element as well as a sort of likelihood element. So you can look all that up on the internet. In my experience, a good warning system needs to have 4 elements. A, technical capability to access, filter, record, and make sense of a huge amount of data and information. Point 1, you have to have that. And Carina has spoken about this in almost the same terms when she was talking about volcanoes. B, designated assessment bodies to monitor all the risks and turn data into understanding. So that in this case was what Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre was. It's a designated assessment body whose job it is to monitor the risk. C, a formal warning function with the designated body for warning, and that again was what the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre is. And the simplest example of that is a threat level system. I know you can have more complicated. And then D, clear ownership of the response to the warning. And I think if you have a warning system, but you can't actually show who's doing each of these components, then it's probably not going to work properly. So I will very briefly talk about the thing that I'm most obsessed with, which is how you do the assessment and analysis and how you decide when to warn. So collecting the information, monitoring and assessment is a critical component of a warning system. And it's the one that's so often completely overlooked or underinvested in, because essentially it is boring compared to the more shiny things that people want to talk about. But in counterterrorism, every single piece of information that you receive might be the critical one. And the possession of an infinite amount of information can itself be more of a harm than an asset if you don't have a proper means of sorting out the information and a systematic plan for how it's communicated so that it properly informs risk decision making. So possession of information quickly becomes a risk if it's not stored correctly, if you can't access it, or particularly if it then turns out that in hindsight you should have acted upon it. So the organizing of the data is just as important as the collection of it, and must invest in organizing it so that it is accessible and logged. And then you need to keep looking at every piece of incoming information, tracking changes over time, watching the trajectory to put you in the best possible position to get ahead of the threat. And that's the second thing. So deciding to warn, operating a threat level system. The role of those operating the warning function is firstly to understand what we know, and then to take the decision on whether to warn. And this shouldn't be a policy or a political decision. The policy decision is what to do about the warning. The system works best where it is clear which assessment bodies are responsible for warning, and which departments or agencies are responsible for responding to the warning. And to be really clear that that warning is independent of influence, so that it can't be accused of having been used in some way to manipulate people's behaviour. A good warning, proper warning, enables anticipation. And again, I've been struggling a little bit over the last year with quite a lot of stuff about being science-led or evidence-led. You cannot rely solely on science. If you wait for evidence, you will lose confidence in your ability to act before something happens. The point for decision on a warning comes before, not after, you have perfect data. And in terrorism, the greatest risk is before, not after the attack. So it's in the quiet period before anybody knows that the terrorists are planning an attack. So it's important to have really clear indicators and criteria for analysts to apply before they're talking about changes in a threat level. But the critical additional factor is a human one. And that's why it was great to hear Jamila McEwen and Deborah Dixon talking about instinct and the intuitive, because I completely agree with this. I don't think data and science actually helps you operate a warning system, because your analysis needs to be rooted in an understanding of all available information, but it also needs wisdom, experience, judgment, and courage to be able to say, I know this is highly unlikely. I know that we've said it's 99% not likely to happen, but that does mean that it could happen, and I think it's going to happen soon. So that takes real sort of bold action on the part of the analysis to decide when to warn. All of these things are huge topics which we can't possibly discuss in the time, but it's worth adding that there was a debate about false alarms. The best warning ends up looking like a false alarm, because it enables action to be taken, mitigation to be put in place, and an attack to be stopped. So the warnings people see and remember are actually probably the less good warnings, because they're the ones which come too late or aren't heeded. So there's a paradox in there about the best warning is probably underappreciated because people don't realise it worked. Question of timescale has been raised a lot, and there are times for me when foresight and horizon scanning make life harder, not easier. Looking too far into the future or at too large a scale just creates a limitless number of options. Any of these things might happen, and an infinite number of choices that vary how the future will pan out. So for me, in order to provide a warning, the analyst will be stuck with the same difficult task of choosing when to warn. They'll have less clarity, not more clarity, if they've spent ages dealing with horizon scanning and foresight tools. So I would like us to stop talking about predicting the future, because we're actors in the future. We don't predict it, we change it by our actions. And instead, if we're going to use those tools, which are a part of the toolkit, but not the overriding thing, then I think we should talk about they help us to think about the future. They do not help us decide when to warn. Warning needs to be authoritative, so you need a single empowered voice, and it also needs most of the time to be right, which is very difficult to get right, and it's the subject of a much longer talk, but I just want to acknowledge that that is at the heart of the difficulty. And then finally, making sure the warning is heard and acted upon. In counterterrorism, it's very helpful to have a formal warning system, and the way it works in the UK government is that any changes to the national threat level must be announced publicly by the Home Secretary, and that makes things so much easier because you know that you are part of a system which is designed to be heard, and it's also very clear across all elements of the risk who holds which responsibility for which bit of it. So the threat levels themselves do not, and this was very interesting for me hearing the earlier contributions, the threat levels do not require specific action from the public, although announcing them in public obviously plays an important role in the public communications, but they are actually a tool for the security practitioners working across different sectors of the critical national infrastructure and protective security, so the police, to use in determining what level of protective security might be required. So if that warning relates to a threat overseas, then that lead sits with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office through the network of embassies overseas. If the warning pertains to the UK, then the response lead for the protective security sits with the police, who can call for military assistance. And the operational command sits within that chain. And then, you know, if a crisis happens, which it will, it is a certainty that we will be surprised by terrorism, then the operational command is then overseen by the Prime Minister and ministers through the Cabinet Office crisis response team. But the command, the responsibility is clear at every level. And it's worth adding, this is a clarification, because I think, again, we got confused in the pandemic. In counterterrorism, there is a clear distinction between the threat level and the response posture, what might be termed an alert level. So the one describes the threat and the other guides the response. There is no automaticity between the two, between the threat level change and the protective posture response. And I think that that's what the government sought to replicate with the COVID alert levels and then the response postures, which were the tiering systems. But I don't think it was clear enough in the labelling and messaging that what that distinction was. And to finish on the pandemic, so my view is that the biosecurity risks, pandemics, could be managed in exactly the same way as terrorism, floods, volcanoes, whatever. The fact that they weren't was simply a systemic failing. The problem was not a lack of foresight. It had been identified. The problem was a lack of investment in assessment, monitoring, trajectory mapping, and a formal warning system. And that might sound really conventional. I'm afraid I have a really conventional view about this, but I think that the only way to be prepared against predictably unpredictable things is to really know what you're doing and look out for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for some really great insights. And indeed, I very much liked the comment of, we need to have courage to warn, because obviously there's so much uncertainties around timings and when to warn, as you say, and also just stop pretending that we can predict and we can't always get it right. And that's sort of a pressure that faces everyone, and I think particularly scientists as well as politicians. So thank you for some great insights there, lots to come back to. But next I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Catalina Jamie. Catalina is currently the manager of the Climate and Conflict Unit at the Climate Centre of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Centre. And she has coordinated a number of global strategic development and forecasting, financing, anticipatory action, and has been the knowledge manager for the Science of Humanitarian Emergencies and Resilience programme. Whilst her background is in industrial engineering with an MA in humanitarian action, she's currently doing her PhD on early warning systems and early actions in situations of conflict at the University of Twente. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. She has more than 16 years experience in humanitarian action, most of them working in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in places such as Colombia, Nepal, Haiti, Uganda, Madagascar, and the Philippines. So we're really pleased to have you here today. Welcome, Catalina, and I shall pass over to you.
Thank you, Carina and Ilan. I'm absolutely delighted for this invitation, and I really congratulate you for setting up this center, which I think is absolutely necessary in this moment. And Suzanne, thank you for your presentation. That was fascinating. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you from terrorism to climate. There are definitely some similarities to what Susanna was sharing, but clearly there are elements that are different. So I'm going to tell you basically a story of the work that we have been doing in the Red Cross and Red Crescent for many years on early warning and early action. So, I mean, we have been working on early warning systems for many, many years. We have done community-based early warning systems, working with governments on setting up national level early warning systems. We have learned over the past years what are those challenges and gaps that really limit us to translate early warnings into early actions. So I'm just going to share with you today some of these learnings and what we have done so far tackle some of these challenges, to really make sure that this warning process translate into real actions that are reducing risks, in particular in the communities that are more vulnerable. So I'm going to share with you like 3 key elements. So the challenges on the forecast and the warning element, but also on the early action planning and the financing like part of the equation. So when we look at forecasting and warning in like historically in the work that we have been doing, like normally the warning has focused on the hazard. Like how do we really understand like the characteristics of the hazard, the lead times of the hazards, the magnitudes, and so on. And I think we have advanced beautifully in kind of like being able to monitor and predict. However, the decision-making process to act, it is not only about the hazard, it is about understanding risk. And I think that has been definitely one of the big gaps into this process, on integrating really that knowledge of the forecast for the different hazards, but also with the understanding of like risk in general, of like who is exposed, who is more likely to be impacted, no? So kind of like bringing together all this type of information is absolutely essential. There was something that I think Brian Golding mentioned in one of the questions in the previous session, which is also about the communication element, no? And I love that cartoon that I just put there, because it like really shows the importance of like really having the clear messaging that don't confuse people. And we have like millions of examples of like how warnings have failed because they haven't been communicated properly. So some of the things that we have been doing in the last years is trying to kind of like really like understand risk clearly, to be able to develop a forecast system or a warning system that really translates into action. So one of these concepts that we have been developing for many years is the concept of impact-based forecasting, or like how basically we can like obtain a forecast information that really tell us what are the impacts that could happen, who is more likely to be impacted if we have X or Y magnitude of a hazard. So there are organizations here in the UK and globally that have been working like a lot to really improve that idea of translating forecasting into impacts. I think like Brian Golden, who is here in the line, he's like one of the biggest starts on this type of work. So now I'm going to move into the more action part of the equation. One of the big gaps is really making sure that we have like early action that address risk, that really responds to the risk that existing at the community level. And for that, one of the biggest failures have been on doing proper early action planning. So over the years in the Red Cross and Red Crescent, we have really invested on trying to make sure that we develop a planning that really have an integration of understanding risk, to really know for what we are planning for, and really having an understanding of like the historical impact of disasters, who has been more impacted in the past, how people has been impacted, to really understand like what are all these key risks, and then define clearly what are all these actions that really make sense to take based on a particular warning. So all this work basically has been like translated like within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement on systems that really show us clearly what are the actions that we can take at different time scales, according to different lifetimes and probabilities of the potential or the hazard. So this is not like one piece of work that is still evolving. There is still a lot of work to do to making sure that all the Red Crosses and Red Crescents across the world like really develop these systems like to make sure that the early action planning part is very strong. There is one element that is the thing that sometimes brings all together, and sometimes the elephant on the room, which is the anticipatory financing element. Because we could have, in many cases, a brilliant warning, we can have a very good plan, but in many cases, if we don't have the financing means to really be able to take those actions, our plan failed. So many years ago, the story was different. There was, in the humanitarian system, there was actually not a financing mechanism that could be used based on a warning to be able to take early action. That didn't actually existed before. Before 2018, we didn't have that. And after many years of like test and advocacy and a lot of work at kind of like policy level and practice and research, that situation changed. So within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, as well within the NGOs, particularly led by the START network, and within the UN system led by OCHA and WFP and FAO and others. So we set up actually financing mechanisms that any like humanitarian organization in this case can access to be able to act before a disaster based on a warning. And that is like it's a really fantastic story to tell, because it has been the result of a lot of work, like a multidisciplinary work with researchers across like everywhere in the world, I would say, like different like institutions at policy level, donors, and then the humanitarian development kind of system in general. So this is a picture that is changing. It is not perfect, of course. There is way many things that we still need to do to be able to take this process up to a scale. This is an example of in the Red Cross, Red Crescent, for instance, how our kind of like financing system kind of like works among all our kind of like disaster continuing process. And it is just like fascinating to see, like how the work of research and policy, is really translating in practical things. Yet there are many challenges, and Carina, asked me to share like, what do you think are like one of these key issues that we should be paying attention for in the area of early warning and early action? So I want to kind of like bring to your attention two things. So I think, and I love the presentation from Deborah in the previous session about heat in Australia, because it is about that. Like one of the biggest challenges that we have now and ahead of us is heat stress, and warnings for heat stress and early action related to heat. There is still a lot of research and understanding that needs to be developed for us and for like everybody around the world that is exposed to heat stress to be able to take action for heat waves. So we know that, I mean, heat waves is a silent killer. And one of the critical aspects is that is actually not well recorded. Like in many places of the world, when people die because of a heat wave, in the health systems, there are no proper ways to record that the person has died because of heat stress. And that is a very problematic aspect if we think about understanding risk and what we need really to be able to take, to develop the warnings and to develop the early action plans for that. And we need that understanding of who is more vulnerable, who is really more exposed to be able to suffer from this particular hazard. So I think that is definitely a key aspect that I bring to attention, that needs more research, that needs more development, from the research perspective, development and humanitarian and others. Another one, and that is very close to my heart because it's what I'm focusing on now, is the aspect of early warning and early action in situations of conflict. So clearly we look at the population that is more likely to be impacted by different climate change impacts is the most vulnerable people in general, and if we can dig down into populations that have been affected by armed conflict for years for different type of reasons, people living on the conflict areas, people that are living in refugee or IDP camps, is population that is extremely exposed. So if we look at the picture of what is happening in early warning and early action in this context, is actually very poor. There is no research, there is no a clear understanding, there are not a lot of practices and lessons and so on. So this is definitely a big area that needs more attention for all of us, that hopefully the new research center can, also like kind of like focus and on a better understanding of like how can we do like warnings that really are tailored for supporting like conflict affected population. So with that, I would like to invite you to, if you want like more information about the work that we are doing in the Red Cross and Red Crescent, but in general in the humanitarian center with the UN system and the NGO like world and many development partners. Join us in the Anticipation Hub. I can provide you more information about it. There is a lot of fantastic practices and ideas that are happening with this lovely community. So thank you so much, Carina. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Catalina. That was brilliant. And you used some of my favorite things. Some of my favorite phrases are money talks, which of course you exemplify. Also, that a picture can paint 1,000 words, which you did with the cartoons, which is brilliant. And of course, addressing the silent killer. And of course, we've had the tragic news of so many killed in Canada due to heat just this morning coming across on the radio. So a really important issue that you've raised there, and of course the need to work together on anticipation, very critical work. So thank you very much for that. So for our final speaker, I would like to introduce Sophie Danritha. Sophie is the co-founder and director of the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, which is a non-profit that connects policymakers to leading academics who work on important long-term challenges. This issue was raised a bit earlier in the chat and in Suzanne's discussion as well. She's also a research affiliate at Cambridge University Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. So Sophie, we are so glad that you could be with us here today, and we look forward to hearing your reflections. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carina, and hi everyone. I'm Sophie Danritha, as Carina says, a director at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience here in London. Carina mentioned that we're a non-profit helping governments think about the long-term challenges of our time. These are challenges like artificial intelligence, global pandemics, as well as climate change scenarios too. I should add that I spent 5 years working in a range of roles in the UK civil service, including at the Cabinet Office, where I looked at building a civil service that's fit for the future and the future challenges. So drawing on this experience, I'm going to talk today about 3 things. Firstly, extreme risks and their nature. Secondly, whether effective warning systems can be developed to them, whether that in fact is possible. And thirdly, what governments can do to build resilience to extreme risks. It's in fact this challenge of understanding what the most serious global threats are that motivated me to found CLTR. It struck me whilst working in government that it was all too easy to be distracted by short-term urgent things, that briefing for the minister that needs to be done by yesterday, or that inflammatory media article which needs to be rebutted swiftly. Or maybe even the slide pack, which needs to be formatted in the perfect font with the perfect alignments before sending to your boss's boss ASAP. So there's always an excuse, and often a reasonable excuse, for not getting to the really big stuff. Stuff like safeguarding current and future generations from potentially disastrous scenarios. For example, ensuring that the trajectory of artificial intelligence leads to good outcomes for all citizens and not to, say, totalitarian regimes or accidents when a machine does what we told it to do, but it wasn't really what we meant. In fact, it can be strangely hard as a policymaker to even begin to try to understand the outside world, let alone get ahead of impending crises and digest warnings. I remember in one role having to use video conferencing software that only worked for internal meetings, effectively barring you from having access to global outside expertise. But this tendency to look inwards and to think about the short term can contribute to disastrous outcomes, especially if it leads to neglecting extreme risks. When I talk about extreme risks, kindly also flagged by Suzanne earlier, I mean high impact events with a global reach. So they range from an event like COVID-19, but the worrying thing is that an event like COVID-19 is at the lower end of the spectrum of extreme risks. So the spectrum goes right up to what we call existential risk, the total destruction of humanity. Oxford University's Toby Ord puts the chance of an existential risk over the next century as 1 in 6. That's the same odds as Russian roulette. So a quick plug, I'm afraid. If you'd like to learn more about what extreme risks are and how we can build resilience to them, we've published a report called Future Proof, written in collaboration with Toby. It's a roadmap that has concrete and actionable policy recommendations for government and focuses on AI and biosecurity as 2 neglected risks. I've popped a link through in the chat, so hopefully that's come through to a summary. And moving on to the second part of this talk, can warnings help us avoid these extreme risk events? So can they help us avoid another global pandemic or even a more serious and more disastrous global event? When preparing for this talk, I was drawn more to the difficulties of establishing effective warning systems. And I think that's a message that Suzanne talked about as well. So I hope to learn more today from fellow panelists and from the audience about whether there is more that we can learn from warning systems work to really help us ensure that an extreme risk event doesn't happen. So why is it difficult, and why are extreme risks special, and why do they interest me so much? Well, they're different from all other risks in that what's at stake is so high. When looking at existential risk, we cannot afford for it to happen even once. And to state the obvious, given that we're all here today, we don't have a precedent for an existential risk event. Even if Toby's estimate of 1 in 6 is a long way off and is inaccurate, working better to understand and, if possible, predict and mitigate possible extreme risks is hugely important work. The nature of these risks make them difficult to assess and address compared to more regularly occurring events like floods, earthquakes, and terrorist attacks. We've got fewer past events to study and learn from, though COVID-19 is clearly an opportunity to learn lessons for better understanding of all extreme risks. But just because something is hard doesn't mean that we should write it off as out of our hands. The more that I've worked with experts at the Centre for Existential Risk in Cambridge and the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, the more I've learned that there are, in fact, many practical steps that we can take to build our resilience. And that's what Future Proof is all about. There are also promising signs here in the UK that better government warning systems are being developed. The Integrated Review, mentioned earlier, announced a comprehensive national resilience strategy with a commitment to include threats and all kinds of risks, including the possibility of these low probability catastrophic impact events. I also hope that the recently announced Cabinet Office National Situation Centre will include extreme risks in its remit. It appears to be a hub for information gathering during times of crisis, which I think sounds very promising. I'll close with the third part of my talk, which is 3 warnings-focused recommendations from Future Proof. So first of all, and in terms of artificial intelligence and its trajectory, we think that the UK government should establish its own capacity to anticipate and monitor AI progress and its implications for society. This would inform future AI policy and regulation to help manage the societal implications of AI. It would also mitigate the risks of increasingly widely deployed AI applications in critical areas. So it would be really great to see increased capacity inside government for establishing metrics and mechanisms to assess progress in AI, and also to create funding for research projects in AI foresight and progress tracking. I think more generally, secondly, investing further in improving long-term forecasting and planning is really necessary for extreme risks in particular. So the relatively new field of forecasting has the potential to substantially improve how well we can predict the probabilities of future disasters and thus help allocate resources towards the risks that are both the most serious and the most likely. So whilst they can't help you predict the future completely, they can help you make really sensible resource decisions. So we'd recommend looking at the body of work that Philip Tetlock has done and the Good Judgment Project. And also it's great that Cosmic Bazaar, the internal civil service forecasting platform, seems to be going well, and applying forecasting to government work. So then thirdly, and this echoes Suzanne's call earlier today, I'd argue that we do really well to accept reality and plan for the unknown. We live in an unpredictable world where extreme risk events could happen, and we hope that they don't. Our only certainty is that the future will not play out how we imagine it will. To give us the best chance of preventative action, we need greater technical expertise in government, as well as regular information about rapidly changing technology flowing into government. A really important lesson we can learn for the next rare catastrophe is that the best response is likely to change rapidly. So we need advance agreements about who is accountable for exactly what, about how decisions will be made, and how communication in times of crisis will happen. Neglecting this or building elaborate, hard to reverse plans based on what we think now risks creating more barriers to taking the correct action in the future. So this means we need plans, but they need to be flexible and fluid plans rather than rigid ones that ties us to dated or to outdated thinking. I'll close just by saying I'm really excited about the role that the Warning Research Centre will play in the coming years in keeping us safe from all types of threats. There really is a fantastic opportunity for transformative change in how the UK builds resilience, and developing effective warning systems, as well as understanding where and when warnings won't serve us, is a key piece of the puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was really great. So I'd like to just call all our panelists onto the screen right now. And I just as a little bit of a summary before I just ask a question and see what your responses are. I thought it was fascinating because essentially, you know, Suzanne, you really highlighted this issue that warnings are not on the agenda. And indeed at the event last week, I highlighted how warnings were very rarely mentioned in any of the pandemic preparedness documents produced by various health organisations, which is a little bit unfortunate because we might not have been in the situation we are now if that had not been the case. And so, you know, so getting warnings on the agenda is sort of almost the starting point, which is kind of a bit sad, really, isn't it? But also just all three of your talks, sorry, have talked about preparedness, the need for investing, the need for adaptation, the need for working with uncertainty and planning for the unknown, whether that's something that's, you know, pretty big and unfathomable, or like a super volcano or something completely not being able to predict, or something that's quite actually, you know, regular and occur at any time, like we have with terrorism. So I think it's very clear that what you are all saying is that in order to bring all these things together, we really do need to see warnings as being part of a social process, a long-term social process. And indeed, you know, here, when we provided evidence to the House of Lords inquiry around a risk assessment, we were really focused on that need to bring warnings to the agenda, make sure that it is a part of the consideration, that it's set up beforehand, that we're doing all our preparatory work beforehand. So with that in mind, I just wanted to ask you each, taking you in the same order again, just a question about what do you think is the biggest gap in creating good practice, and how can we fill it based on your experience? So we'll start off with Suzanne.
So it's easy for me. I'm obsessed with the bit that happens before the warning, and it's particularly bad, I think, in governments where you esteem action over thought. And as Sophie alluded to, the time scales of everyone's attention span is now so short that nobody can you can't justify investing in thinking. But to me, if you don't build the centres of expertise of assessment, and it is assessment and analysis, if you don't have them, you can't provide warning. And it's, to me, it's the same as Carina, I learned from you, you know, when you're monitoring a volcano, you're doing a three-dimensional monitoring of everything: the air, the ground, the water, the everything. And ideally we should have the capability to do that across everything that we think is a risk, whether it's a hazard or a threat. And that means, I'm afraid, and so this is where I disagree with Sophie, I think Tetlock is selling false answers. And I think the answer is hard work and investment in analysts who are going to monitor against the risks.
Great, thank you. And so I'll pass on the same question to Catalina.
Good, thank you. So, I mean, 2 points. So definitely to be able to set up the kind of like the early warning and early action systems, we need to have a long-term thinking. No, so it's clear this is not a matter of just like doing whatever we can in a short term, but this is a systemic like challenge. And I think that is like super important. But I want to go to another different point, which is very related to, I guess, with the role of the center, which is about research and understanding risk. And clearly what we observe with the work that we are doing is that a lot of the research and understanding risk is really concentrated in developed countries. Guys, clearly, like Europe is like super well researched, like risk analysis here is amazing. But if you go to other countries, like my own country, I'm from Colombia, many other countries, it's a different picture. No, like we don't really understand risk very much. And there are a lot of gaps. If we look particularly at heat like risk and heat wave risk, the mapping of research investment is really, really unequal. Like all the research is in Europe, the US, Australia, but you look like Africa, there is zero. Well, not zero, but very, very little. No, so I think that that's definitely a big gap, and I will definitely encourage the center to really bring and work with universities in the South, like really bring kind of like research into developing countries to cover that gap. So over to you.
Thank you, Kathleen. That's a great point. I think that to sort of address that, I think the fact that the centre is actually based in the Department of Science and Technology Studies really enables us to do that. We're working really hard as a department to engage more with literature and work coming out from Global South, from different ethnic and minority groups, and to be more inclusive and take more post-colonial approaches to all the topics that we look at across science. And that feeds into what we're doing here in the Warning Research Centre. So it's a really important point, because obviously, as we've shown today, it all comes down to different contexts and cultural contexts and beliefs and meanings of warnings. And that means we have to look beyond our own little shores, if you like, to those broader aspects. Right, so thank you for that. And lastly, Sophie.
Thanks, Carina. So I think the bit that for me is missing that would really, where we'd really see improvements is having much clearer accountability for risk management and knowing who's doing what at every stage. And I've talked before about having or learning lessons from the 3 lines of defense approach, which is often used in risk management in large organizations, where there could be a first line of defense that is the government departments themselves working to manage all risks, and hopefully with some strengthened resource to manage extreme risks because they're particularly thorny. And then a second line of defense being a chief risk officer who would be very senior and manage all types of risks and be able to sort of share best practice across all of government. And then this third layer would be an institute that would be responsible for independent, depoliticized risk assessment. So able to kind of bring up what challenges are on the horizon or are kind of rapidly developing and present that to people who need to know in government. I think there's also an international aspect as well. So I think Kathleen is exactly right. Where there's a real sort of diplomatic challenge to bring together government risk representatives from around the world to share what's going on, but also share best practice in how they're actively managing risk.
Thank you. And absolutely, I think, I hope that here at the centre we'll be able to help facilitate some studies that look at how different governance and governments manage risk and communicate it, and the different setups, and are there any really positive lessons that we can learn or structures that we can apply elsewhere that might be useful. Of course, we have to always be sensitive to context. So there's lots and lots of work to be done on that. And I think sort of ending on COVID, which we haven't really spoken that much about today, I think COVID in a way provides a really unique opportunity for us to look at one hazard that's affected us all. It's the same hazard, but how different countries, regions and groups have been able to cope, manage or respond to it is quite fascinating, because quite often we end up with sort of hazard events happening in very particular areas, and so this sort of cuts across all of that to give us some really good comparison studies. So that's really going to be a fascinating area to keep us all going, I think, for quite a while. So I'd like to say thank you so much to our panel and for all the questions. There's a few Q&As if our panel want to answer those online, just a few outstanding questions, but thank you so much for your time. It's been a really fascinating session, and I will hand over now to Ilan, who will provide a bit of a summary for the day.
Connections. That has been what we've discussed here. Definitely connections among the panelists and the audience, because it's been wonderful to see the chat, absolutely fabulous to have the questions there and to have the responses going on, but also the discussions among the panel. Also thinking about global connections. So we've gone from different continents, from the local to the global, thinking across different spaces, and also thinking across different times, looking far, far back into the past, thinking about the futures. How do we connect what we know and what we've lost from the past with what we need, what we're hoping for in the future? We've also connected many hazards, while also recognizing the importance of disasters not being really caused by hazards, but coming from vulnerabilities. And the foundational aspect of risk and of disaster risk, and hence disasters, really being vulnerabilities and the connections across them. We have very fortunately pioneered the connecting of science and art, because there's often too much separation, too much dismissal of one by the other, also bringing into aspects of intuition compared to evidence. Not intuition versus evidence, but intuition and evidence, trying to balance them. Other connections have been made regarding news and information. Not that these are really contrasts, although, no, that's not really fair. It's about communication, about different forms of knowledge, different forms of communicating, different forms of interacting, really different forms of connecting. So now that we've done it, so what? What do we do? How do we actually move forward from the difficulties and successes of the past within the current context of the present through to the future which we want, among all the possible futures which we certainly do not want? For me, and I hope for everyone involved in the Warning Research Centre, although not just about warning research, but about warning action, warning practicalities, warning pragmatics, warnings, everyone involved in warnings means that we're all involved with people. It really is this baseline value that warnings are a social process. They are about people, for people, with people, toward people, and therefore have to start with people and involve people. As was said, decisions, choices, options, but opportunities. To have decisions, choices, options, opportunities, we have to have resources. We have to have possibilities. We have to have this nebulous concept of power. This means going beyond the usual. This means recognizing the connections which do not exist, because those who have the power and resources have chosen to remove those connections or simply not create it, to move forward with the status quo. Ultimately, and this word sort of came up in many aspects, particularly the connections, is culture. I use the word values. It's about us. It's about social processes, connecting social processes, creating perpetuating these social processes which we want in order to ensure that warnings make sense and actually function. So it really is up to us to connect and to research and to warn, to ensure that this is all working, which means questioning ourselves, challenging ourselves. We hear so much, for example, about the phrases which we critiqued in the chat, such as saying, well, black swans don't really exist. Then there was a question about king dragons. Some people will suggest, well, it's all about the last mile, but if it's people, it's actually the first mile. We don't want people last, we want people first. And then do we dare still even use the phrase natural disaster, knowing that disasters are not natural? So it's about changing what we value. It's changing how we approach. It's changing how we communicate. It's changing how we connect, even to making sure that things are much more straightforward. There is so much about early warning systems, but we know it's not just about early. It's also late. It's also distant. It's also medium. It's also multidimensional. So we're back to warning systems. But why system? What is a system? What does the word add to it? Just about warnings, which is why we have the Warning Research Centre. Really about warning connections, connecting people, connecting groups, connecting ideas, connecting values, connecting thoughts in order to build up to the behavior and actions we want. Because yes, we're at University College London. We are researchers, but we really want to serve the people, ensure that our science has useful, positive approaches, results, consequences for society. So when we do talk about to warn, when we do talk about to research, when we do talk about to connect, it ultimately is to act, and to act for everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for contributing. Thank you for setting the agenda, and particularly thank you to Carina for organizing all this, but leading it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. I wanted to just take this opportunity to thank all the speakers and presenters today. Also, I would like to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedule in order to prepare and to give their insights and thoughts and reflections on a topic which doesn't normally get spotlighted, if you like. So I'd also like to thank very much the moderators of the sessions, the chairs, Simone Philips, Calum Mackay, and also my deputy director, Ilan Kelman, who has just given a really useful insight there. Also, I would like to thank Victoria Manzi, Giuseppe La Rosa, and the rest of the STS team for helping to make today such a useful and engaging session, but also making sure that it ran smoothly. And we've managed to make it to time despite a few glitches along the way. And I feel somewhat disappointed that we've not had more time to start so many conversations that we've begun. We've begun so many wonderful conversations and ideas, and I really wanted to continue those, but that's the whole point of the centre. The whole point of the centre is that this is the start of the conversation, that this is the where we start to open that Pandora's box and start those conversations, keep these dialogues going between all these different stakeholders. So we very much hope that you will keep in touch with us, that you will reach out to us to collaborate with us, and so that we can work together to really make a difference and help make warnings get on the agenda and for warnings to be more effective for the people. And that means we need to keep our connection, and it means that we also need to communicate more between ourselves at all. So thank you again to everyone everyone today. Thank you for taking time and sitting in front of your screen this afternoon. We hope you found it interesting. And please do keep an eye on our social media and our website for future events. There will be quite a few more before the end of the year, which we will be lining up shortly. So please do keep in touch. And of course, if you want to run an event, or if you feel like there's something that you want to highlight and talk about, please do contact us and we can make that happen. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye-bye.